Chapter 1. The Girl Who Sees. Luna Lovegood had always seen things that others missed, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. She sat curled in the window seat of Ravenclaw Tower's common room, her bare feet tucked beneath her pale blue robes, a copy of the Quibbler spread across her lap. The October morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting shifting patterns across the pages as she adjusted her spectre specs for the third time in as many minutes. The large, colourful frames felt heavier today, as though they were preparing her for something she wasn't quite ready to see. "Daddy says the Rotfang conspiracy is spreading faster than anyone imagined," she murmured to herself, tracing a finger along the article's margins. But the words seemed to swim before her eyes, and she found herself gazing out the window instead, watching the lake ripple in the distance. Through the spectre specks, she could see the usual shimmer of rack spurts, floating lazily through the air. But there was something else today, a restless energy that made her skin prickle with unease. The common room was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few seventh years hunched over their defense against the dark arts essays, and one second year who kept glancing nervously at Luna as though her very presence might contaminate his transfiguration homework. Luna was accustomed to such looks. She'd learned long ago that most people saw her as something between a curiosity and a threat, too strange to ignore, too harmless to fear outright. But the spectre specs showed her what people really were beneath their carefully constructed facades. The nervous second year, for instance, was surrounded by a cloud of anxious purple mist that pulsed with each rapid heartbeat. The seventh years radiated the dull grey fog of exhaustion and stress, punctuated by sharp yellow spikes whenever they encountered a particularly difficult passage in their textbooks. Luna closed the Quibbler and stood, smoothing down her robes. Breakfast would be starting soon, and she found that the great hall offered the most interesting observations of the day. So many people gathered in one place, all of them broadcasting their emotional states in colours and shapes that only she could see. The corridors of Hogwarts felt different this year, charged with an undercurrent of fear that Luna could taste like copper pennies on her tongue. Students hurried past with their heads down, whispering about you-know-who and the Ministry's refusal to acknowledge his return. Through her spectre specs, Luna could see the dark tendrils of worry that followed them like shadows, growing thicker each day. She paused outside the great hall, taking a moment to prepare herself for the sensory assault that awaited. Through the spectre specs, large gatherings were overwhelming, hundreds of emotional auras blending and clashing in a kaleidoscope of human feeling that could leave her dizzy if she wasn't careful. Luna pushed open the heavy doors and immediately felt the familiar rush of overlapping energies. The Gryffindor table blazed with the red gold of determination and barely contained anger, while the Slytherin table shimmered with the cold silver of calculation and ambition. Hufflepuff radiated warm yellows and earthy browns, comfort and loyalty, and her own Ravenclaw table sparkled with the blues and purples of curiosity and intellectual pursuit. She made her way to an empty spot near the middle of the Ravenclaw table, nodding to a few acquaintances who acknowledged her presence with polite, if distant, smiles. Luna had learned not to take such reactions personally. People were generally uncomfortable with those who saw too much. As she reached for a piece of toast, her gaze drifted across the hall to the Gryffindor table, where Harry Potter sat, hunched over his porridge, looking as though he hadn't slept properly in weeks. Ron Weasley was speaking animatedly beside him, gesturing with his spoon, while Hermione Granger's nose was buried in what appeared to be a book on advanced magical theory. Luna had always found Harry Potter interesting, though she'd never had much occasion to speak with him beyond polite exchanges in the corridors. He was famous, of course, and there was something about fame that created its own sort of magical distortion, like looking at someone through water. But through her spectre specs, fame mattered far less than truth. She adjusted the colourful frames again and focused her attention on Harry, prepared to see the usual mixture of teenage emotions, perhaps the green of envy, the grey of melancholy, or the bright red of anger that seemed to follow him this year like a personal storm cloud. What she saw instead made her drop her toast. Around Harry's forehead, coiled like a serpent made of shadow and malice, was something dark and writhing that seemed to pulse with its own terrible life. It clung to his scar like a parasite, its edges flickering between solid darkness and something far worse, an absence of light so complete that looking at it made Luna's eyes water behind her spectre specs. The fragment, for lack of a better word, reacted to Harry's emotional state, growing larger and more agitated, when Ron said something that made Harry scowl, shrinking to a dull throb when Hermione placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. But it never disappeared entirely, and Luna realized with growing horror that it wasn't simply feeding on Harry's emotions. It was part of him. Luna sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the dark thing twist and writhe around Harry's scar. She'd seen parasitic magical creatures before, rackspurts, nargles, even the occasional heliopath, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't a creature that had attached itself to Harry from the outside. This was something that had been woven into the very fabric of his being, so thoroughly integrated that separating it would be like trying to remove someone's shadow. The thought made her feel queasy, but she forced herself to keep watching, to understand what she was seeing. The fragment pulsed in rhythm with something that wasn't Harry's heartbeat, something faster, more urgent, tinged with a malevolence that made Luna's skin crawl. When Harry laughed at something Ron said, the fragment contracted, as though the sound caused it physical pain. When his expression darkened at the sight of Professor Umbridge entering the Great Hall, the fragment seemed to grow stronger, more defined. Luna realized she was gripping her pumpkin juice so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She forced herself to relax, to breathe, to think rationally about what she was witnessing. There had to be an explanation, something in her father's magazines or the restricted section of the library that could help her understand what Harry Potter was carrying around inside his head. Because whatever it was, Luna was certain of one thing: Harry had no idea it was there. She watched as Harry stood from the table, shouldering his book bag with the weary resignation of someone who expected nothing but misery from the day ahead. The fragment coiled tighter around his scar, and Luna caught a glimpse of something that made her stomach lurch. For just a moment, the darkness seemed to have eyes, red and gleaming, and full of an intelligence that was distinctly not Harry's. Luna stood abruptly, causing several nearby Ravenclaws to glance in her direction. She offered them a vague smile, and followed Harry out of the Great Hall, keeping her distance, but maintaining visual contact through the crowd of students making their way to morning classes. Harry turned toward the library, and Luna felt a flutter of relief. The library was safer somehow, quieter, with fewer people to witness whatever she was about to discover. She waited until Harry had disappeared through the library doors before following, her heart still racing with the implications of what she'd seen. Inside the library, Luna found Harry seated at one of the tables near the Transfiguration section, a stack of books open in front of him, as he worked on what appeared to be an essay for Professor McGonagall. He looked tired, more than tired actually, exhausted in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens too heavy for someone his age to carry. Luna selected a book on magical creatures from a nearby shelf and settled at a table 2 rows away, positioning herself so she had a clear view of Harry while appearing to be absorbed in her reading. Through her spectre specs, the fragment around his scar had settled into a dull, pulsing rhythm. But she could see it react every time Harry encountered something stressful in his work. When he struggled with a particularly difficult passage about vanishing spells, the fragment grew darker, more agitated. When he successfully completed a section and moved on to the next paragraph, it seemed to dim slightly, as though disappointed by his progress. The pattern was so clear, so consistent, that Luna began to wonder if the fragment was somehow influencing Harry's emotional state, feeding on his stress and frustration while simultaneously contributing to it. The thought was deeply disturbing. Luna pretended to read about Thestrals while she observed Harry's interaction with the darkness in his scar. She'd been able to see Thestrals since she was 9 years old, when her mother's experimental spell had gone wrong, and Luna had watched her die in a flash of light and agony that still haunted her dreams. Death, she'd learned, changed how one saw the world. It added layers of perception that others couldn't access, revealed truths that were hidden from those who'd never looked directly into the void. But this was different from seeing thestrals. This was seeing something that should not exist, something that violated the very nature of life and soul, and the boundaries between self and other. Luna closed her book and stood, walking slowly toward Harry's table. He looked up as she approached, his green eyes shadowed with fatigue and wariness. The fragment around his scar pulsed once, sharply, as though responding to her proximity. "Hello, Harry," she said, her voice soft and careful. "You look troubled." Harry glanced around the library, as though checking for witnesses to this conversation. "Oh, hi, Luna. I'm just working on an essay. Nothing troubling about that." But there was something troubling about it, Luna realized. The fragment had grown more active the moment she'd spoken to him, writhing around his scar like a thing in pain. It didn't like her attention, didn't want to be observed or acknowledged. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Harry shrugged, which she took as permission. Luna settled herself carefully, adjusting her spectre specs so she could observe the fragment more clearly. This close, she could see details that had been hidden from a distance, the way it seemed to be made of shadow and malice twisted together, the way it pulsed in rhythm with something that definitely wasn't Harry's heartbeat. "You have shadows around you," Luna said quietly, watching for Harry's reaction. He frowned, glancing down at himself as though expecting to see something obvious. "Shadows? It's pretty well lit in here, Luna." "Not those kinds of shadows." Luna tilted her head, studying the fragment through her spectre specs. "These are the sort that don't belong to you. They're different, older, angrier." Harry's frown deepened, and the fragment responded by coiling tighter around his scar. Luna felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the thing was listening to their conversation, reacting to her words with what could only be described as hostility. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harry said, but his voice carried an uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to wonder if maybe he did. "You have headaches," Luna observed, not making it a question. "Bad ones. And dreams that don't feel like dreams. Sometimes you feel angry for no reason, or sad, or empty, as though something is taking pieces of you when you're not looking." Harry's face went very pale, and he gripped his quill so tightly that Luna was surprised it didn't snap. The fragment around his scar had gone completely still, as though holding its breath. "How do you—" Harry started, then stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind. You're just guessing. Everyone knows about my scar hurting. It's not exactly a secret." But Luna could see that she'd struck close to something true, something that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The fragment was reacting to his fear now, growing larger and more defined, feeding on his emotional turmoil. "I see things," Luna said simply. "Things that others miss. And what I see around you is concerning." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, let me guess. Nargles? Or maybe it's rack spurts this time." "Nothing so benign," Luna replied, her tone remaining gentle despite the darkness of her words. "This is something much worse. Something that shouldn't be there at all." For a moment, Harry just stared at her, and Luna could see him wrestling with the urge to dismiss her as mad versus the growing suspicion that she might be right about something he'd never been able to name. The fragment seemed to sense his internal conflict and began pulsing faster, more urgently. "I should go," Harry said abruptly, beginning to pack his books. "I have defense against the dark arts next, and Umbridge gets upset when people are late." Luna nodded, making no move to stop him. "Of course. But Harry, if you ever want to talk about the shadows, I'll be here. I'm not frightened of them." Harry paused in his packing, looking at her with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. "Why would you want to help me? Most people think I'm either lying or mad." "Because," Luna said, adjusting her spectre specs one final time, "I think you're carrying something very heavy, and no one should have to carry such things alone." Harry finished packing his bag and stood, slinging it over his shoulder. The fragment around his scar had settled back into its usual dull pulsing, but Luna could see that their conversation had disturbed it, left it somehow more active than before. "Thanks," Harry said quietly, and Luna could tell he meant it, even though he didn't fully understand what he was thanking her for. After he left, Luna remained seated at the table, staring at the space where Harry had been, and trying to process what she'd witnessed. The fragment wasn't just attached to Harry, it was integrated into him so completely that removing it would likely kill him, but leaving it there might be even worse, especially if it continued to grow stronger, more influential. Luna had seen enough death to recognize it when it was lurking nearby. And whatever Harry Potter was carrying in his scar, it reeked of death in ways that made her bones ache with remembered grief. That evening, Luna sat alone in her dormitory, surrounded by books she'd borrowed from the deepest, most forgotten corners of the library. Her roommates had long since gone to bed, leaving her free to research without curious questions or concerned glances. The books made for disturbing reading. Texts on soul magic, on the ways that dark wizards had tried throughout history to cheat death, on the prices paid for power that exceeded natural boundaries. Luna read about Horcruxes, objects that contained fragments of a wizard's soul, split through the act of murder, and felt her stomach twist with recognition. If Harry Potter was carrying a piece of someone else's soul, then someone had committed murder specifically to create that fragment. Someone had torn their own soul apart and left a piece of it lodged in Harry's scar, probably during the night his parents died. Luna closed the book and removed her spectre specs, rubbing her tired eyes. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and absolutely certain. Harry Potter wasn't just the boy who lived. He was also a living Horcrux, carrying within himself a fragment of the very person who had tried to kill him. And Luna was the only person who could see it. She put her spectre specs back on and stared at her reflection in the darkened window, watching the rack spurts that always gathered around her when she was thinking particularly hard. Tomorrow, she would need to observe Harry more carefully, to understand how the fragment affected him and how it might be controlled or contained. Because if she was right about what she'd seen, then Harry Potter was in more danger than anyone realized. And despite what he might think about her strange habits and stranger beliefs, Luna Lovegood was the only person at Hogwarts who truly understood what he was facing. The question now was what, if anything, she could do to help him before the fragment of Voldemort's soul decided to claim its host entirely. Luna gathered her books and prepared for bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that writhing darkness around Harry's scar, pulsing with malevolent life and ancient hunger. She'd thought she understood death, had believed that watching her mother die had shown her all the ways that life could be twisted and corrupted. She'd been wrong. This was something far worse than death. This was the deliberate destruction of the soul itself, and Harry Potter had been carrying the evidence of that crime on his forehead for 15 years. Luna pulled her blankets up to her chin and tried not to think about what it might be costing him, day after day, to host such darkness within himself. She tried not to wonder how much of Harry's anger and pain was truly his own, and how much belonged to the fragment that fed on his suffering like a parasite made of shadow and malice. But most of all, she tried not to think about what would happen if the fragment ever grew strong enough to take control completely. Because Luna Lovegood had seen many strange and terrible things through her spectre specs, but she'd never seen anything that frightened her quite as much as the possibility that Harry Potter might already be losing, the war being fought inside his own soul. Chapter 2. Fragments and Truths. Luna spent the next morning researching in the most methodical way she knew how, by asking questions that seemed innocent enough to avoid suspicion, but pointed enough to yield useful information. She found Professor Flitwick in his office during his free period, grading second-year essays on the cheering charm, with the same meticulous attention he applied to everything else. "Professor," Luna said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. Flitwick looked up with the mild surprise he always showed when students visited him outside of class, but his expression quickly warmed into genuine welcome. "Miss Lovegood, how delightful! What brings you to my office on such a lovely Tuesday morning?" Luna adjusted her spectre specs, watching the gentle golden aura that surrounded Professor Flitwick like a comfortable blanket. He was one of the few professors at Hogwarts whose emotional emanations never contained any darkness, just layers of curiosity, kindness, and the deep satisfaction that came from a life spent in pursuit of magical understanding. "I've been reading about soul magic," Luna said, her tone carefully casual, "for an independent research project. I was wondering if you could recommend some additional texts." Flitwick's eyebrows rose slightly, and Luna watched as his aura shifted to include pale threads of concern. "Soul magic. That's quite an advanced topic, Miss Lovegood. Might I ask what specifically has captured your interest?" "The ways that souls can be divided," Luna replied, choosing her words with deliberate precision. "Or damaged. I read something about soul fragments in one of Daddy's magazines, and I found myself curious about the magical theory behind such things." The concern in Flitwick's aura deepened, taking on the darker blue of genuine worry. He set down his quill and leaned forward, studying Luna with the sharp attention that had made him a dueling champion in his younger years. "Soul magic is not a subject to approach lightly, Miss Lovegood. The manipulation of souls, particularly the intentional division or damage of them, requires acts of such evil that most wizards find it difficult even to conceive of them." "But it's possible," Luna pressed gently. "Theoretically speaking?" Flitwick was quiet for a long moment, his aura cycling through several shades of unease before settling on a resigned sort of sadness. "Yes," he said finally. "It is possible. There are dark practices that allow a wizard to split their soul, usually through the commission of murder, which tears the soul apart. These fragments can then be preserved in objects, creating what are known as horcruxes." Luna felt her stomach clench with recognition, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "How terrible," she murmured. "And if someone were to encounter such an object—" "They would be in grave danger," Flitwick said firmly. "Horcruxes exert a corrupting influence on those around them. Prolonged exposure can lead to possession, madness, or worse. They are among the darkest artifacts in existence." "What if the fragment weren't in an object?" Luna asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "What if it were somehow attached to a person?" Flitwick's aura went completely grey with shock, and Luna realized she'd pushed too hard, revealed too much of her specific interest. The professor stared at her for several heartbeats, his mind clearly racing through possibilities that Luna very much hoped he wouldn't pursue. "Miss Lovegood," he said slowly, "why are you asking these questions?" Luna manufactured her most dreamy smile, the one that made people think she was harmlessly eccentric, rather than dangerously perceptive. "Oh, just curiosity. You know how I am about unusual, magical creatures. I wondered if a soul fragment might behave like a parasite. It wasn't entirely a lie, which made it more convincing." Flitwick's aura lightened slightly, though threads of concern remained woven through the gold. "I would strongly recommend that you limit your research to theoretical texts," he said carefully, "and perhaps focus on defensive magic rather than the creation of such horrors. Professor McGonagall has some excellent books on protective charms that might interest you." Luna nodded agreeably, already planning her next research session in the restricted section. "Of course, Professor. Thank you for your time." She left Flitwick's office with her suspicions confirmed and a growing sense of urgency. If Harry was indeed carrying a soul fragment, a Horcrux, then he was in constant danger from its corrupting influence. Worse, if anyone discovered what he carried, they might decide that destroying the Horcrux was worth sacrificing Harry himself. The restricted section of the library was quieter than usual when Luna slipped inside during the lunch period, her spectre specs allowing her to see the thin, magical barriers that protected the most dangerous texts. She'd learned long ago how to move through such protections without triggering them, a skill that had served her well during her years of independent research. The books on soul magic were kept in the deepest part of the restricted section, behind additional wards that made Luna's skin prickle with unease. She found what she was looking for in a slim volume, bound in midnight black leather. The Darkest Arts, an exploration of soul manipulation and its consequences. The book felt wrong in her hands, radiating a cold malevolence that made her fingers ache. Through her spectre specs, she could see the dark emanations that surrounded it like a poisonous fog, warning away anyone with the sense to recognize danger. Luna opened the book to the chapter on Horcruxes and immediately understood why soul magic was considered the darkest of all magical arts. The creation of a Horcrux requires the deliberate murder of another being, she read, her whispered voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent section. This act of ultimate evil tears the murderer's soul, allowing them to place the damaged fragment in an object of their choosing. The resulting Horcrux becomes an anchor to life, preventing the creator's death even if their body is destroyed. Luna turned the page, her hands trembling slightly as she read about the various objects that had been used as Horcruxes throughout history. Jewelry, weapons, books, items that could be hidden away and protected while still maintaining their connection to their creator's soul. But the passage that made her blood run cold came several pages later. In rare and accidental cases, a soul fragment may attach itself to a living being rather than an inanimate object. Such instances are extraordinarily dangerous, as the host becomes a living Horcrux, susceptible to possession, madness, and eventual death as the fragment grows stronger. No known method exists for removing a soul fragment from a living host without killing them in the process. Luna closed the book with shaking hands, the implications crashing over her like a wave of icy water. Harry wasn't just carrying Voldemort's soul fragment, he was trapped with it, bound to it in a way that made separation impossible without his death. She sat in the dim light of the restricted section, her mind racing through everything she'd observed about Harry's behavior over the years. His anger, his nightmares, the way his scar hurt during moments of stress, all of it made terrible sense now. He wasn't just marked by Voldemort's failed curse. He was carrying a piece of the Dark Lord's soul inside his own head, and from what she'd read, the situation was only going to get worse. Luna carefully returned the book to its proper place and made her way out of the restricted section, her thoughts churning with possibilities and fears. She needed to observe Harry more carefully, to understand how the fragment affected his daily life, and whether there might be any way to help him manage its influence. Defense against the dark arts seemed like the perfect opportunity for observation. Professor Umbridge's classroom was a study in aggressive cheerfulness, all pink walls and kitten plates that made Luna's eyes water behind her spectre specs. The emotional emanations in the room were a toxic mixture of fear, anger, and barely suppressed rebellion, with Umbridge herself radiating the sickly green of sadistic pleasure at the center of it all. Luna found a seat near the back of the classroom, where she could observe Harry without drawing attention to herself. He sat with Ron and Hermione near the middle, his shoulders tense with barely controlled hostility, as Umbridge launched into another lecture about the Ministry's approved approach to defensive magic. As I was saying, Umbridge continued in her girlish voice, the Ministry has determined that a theoretical knowledge of defensive magic is more than sufficient for your needs. There is no reason for students to practice spells that might be used for offensive purposes. But how are we supposed to defend ourselves if we don't practice? Harry demanded, his voice cutting through the classroom's oppressive atmosphere. Through her spectre specs, Luna watched the fragment around Harry's scar pulse with sudden, violent energy. It responded to his anger like a flame fed by oil, growing larger and more defined as his emotions intensified. "Mr. Potter," Umbridge said sweetly, her aura shifting to a poisonous shade of anticipation, "you will raise your hand if you wish to speak in my classroom." "I wasn't finished," Harry snapped, and Luna saw the fragment writhe with what could only be described as pleasure. It was feeding on his anger, she realized with growing horror. The more upset Harry became, the stronger the fragment grew. "You will serve detention tonight, Mr. Potter," Umbridge announced with obvious satisfaction. "Perhaps that will help you remember proper classroom etiquette." Luna watched Harry's hands clench into fists beneath his desk, saw the fragment around his scar grow so dark and agitated that she was surprised no one else could see it. The thing was practically vibrating with malevolent energy, and Luna began to understand just how dangerous Harry's situation truly was. If the fragment continued to grow stronger every time Harry experienced strong emotions, especially negative ones, then eventually it might become powerful enough to take control. And given Umbridge's talent for provoking exactly the sort of anger that fed the fragment, Harry was essentially being tortured in a way that no one understood. Luna raised her hand, causing several students to turn and stare in surprise. "Yes, Miss Lovegood?" Umbridge asked, her tone suggesting she was prepared to be irritated by whatever Luna might say. "I was wondering," Luna said in her most dreamy voice, "if you could explain why the Ministry believes theoretical knowledge is superior to practical experience. In most magical disciplines, application is considered essential for true understanding." It was a reasonable question, asked in a tone that suggested genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Umbridge blinked, clearly caught off guard by Luna's apparent sincerity. "Well," she said, flustering slightly, "the Ministry has determined that practical application of defensive magic often leads to the learning of offensive techniques. We cannot risk students acquiring knowledge that might be misused." "That's fascinating," Luna replied, and several students turned to stare at her again. "So the Ministry believes that ignorance is safer than competence?" Luna could see Harry's aura shifting as her calm questioning diffused some of his anger, and she watched with satisfaction as the fragment around his scar grew smaller and less active. She'd found a way to help him without drawing attention to her real purpose. "That's not," Umbridge began, but Luna continued as though she hadn't heard the interruption. "I suppose it makes sense from a certain perspective," she mused. "After all, people who don't know how to defend themselves are much easier to control, aren't they?" The classroom went completely silent, and Luna could see the various emotional auras around her classmates, shifting from resignation to something that looked very much like hope. Even Umbridge seemed momentarily speechless, her poisonous green aura flickering with uncertainty. "Miss Lovegood," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "you will also serve detention tonight." Luna smiled serenely, adjusting her spectre specs. "Of course, Professor. I look forward to learning more about the Ministry's educational philosophy." The rest of the class passed without incident, largely because Luna's unexpected defiance had created an atmosphere of stunned confusion that even Umbridge seemed reluctant to disrupt. When the bell rang, Luna gathered her books and made her way toward the door, timing her exit to coincide with Harry's. "Luna," Harry said, as they walked down the corridor together, "you didn't have to do that. You shouldn't have gotten detention because of me." Through her spectre specs, Luna could see that Harry's aura had shifted from angry red to something warmer and more complex, gratitude mixed with confusion and a touch of guilt. The fragment around his scar had settled back to its usual dull pulse, no longer feeding on the anger that Umbridge had deliberately provoked. "I didn't do it because of you," Luna said truthfully. I did it because I dislike seeing ignorance presented as wisdom, though I must admit I found your anger quite interesting." Harry stopped walking, turning to study her with the same suspicious expression he'd worn in the library. "Interesting how?" Luna considered her words carefully, knowing she was walking a dangerous line between truth and revelation. "You carry your emotions very visibly. When you're angry, it's like watching a storm gather. When you're sad, the air around you seems heavier. Most people's emotions are much more subtle." "That's—" Harry frowned, clearly trying to decide whether Luna was being insightful or simply strange. "That doesn't make any sense." "Many true things don't make sense at first," Luna replied, "but that doesn't make them less true." They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Luna found herself watching the subtle interplay between Harry's emotional state and the fragment's activity. When he was calm, as he was now, the fragment seemed almost dormant, but she could see it stirring whenever students whispered as they passed, or when he caught sight of one of Umbridge's educational decrees posted on the walls. "Harry," Luna said, as they reached the junction where their paths diverged, "do you ever feel like there's someone else in your head? Like you're sharing space with something that doesn't belong to you?" Harry stopped so abruptly that a group of second years had to swerve around him. His face went very pale, and Luna watched the fragment around his scar pulse with sudden, sharp energy. "Why would you ask me that?" he demanded, his voice low and urgent. "Because," Luna said gently, "I think you might be carrying something very heavy, and I think it's been getting heavier lately." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and Luna could see him struggling with the urge to confide in someone who seemed to understand what he was experiencing. The fragment was reacting to his emotional turmoil, growing more agitated with each passing second. "You don't know what you're talking about," Harry said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not," Luna agreed, "but sometimes the things we don't understand are the ones that need our attention most." Harry turned and walked away without another word, but Luna could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had clenched into fists again. She'd planted seeds of doubt, made him question whether his experiences were as private as he'd believed. It was a beginning, even if it wasn't the breakthrough she'd hoped for. That evening, after enduring 3 hours of detention with Professor Umbridge, during which Luna had been forced to write, "I will not question ministry policy," with a quill that carved the words into her hand, she sat in her dormitory with a fresh journal spread across her lap. Her roommates were asleep, leaving Luna free to document her observations and theories without fear of curious questions. She wrote by wandlight, the soft glow illuminating pages that would have looked like pure madness to anyone who didn't share her unique perspective. "Day 2 of observations," she wrote in her careful script. "Subject continues to carry soul fragment attached to forehead scar. Fragment responds to emotional stimulation, grows stronger when subject experiences anger, fear, or stress, diminishes during periods of calm or happiness." Luna paused, thinking about the way the fragment had reacted during defense against the dark arts. Fragment appears to feed on negative emotions, possibly using them to maintain or strengthen its presence. This suggests that the host's emotional state directly affects the fragment's power and influence. She turned to a fresh page and began sketching what she saw through her spectre specs, the writhing darkness around Harry's scar, the way it pulsed and twisted in response to his moods. The drawings looked disturbing even to her, like illustrations from the darkest fairy tales. "Research indicates that soul fragments cannot be removed from living hosts without causing death," she continued. "However, most research focuses on artificial attachment of fragments to living subjects. This case appears to be accidental. Fragment attached during failed killing curse when subject was infant." Luna set down her quill and removed her spectre specs, rubbing her tired eyes. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical burden, and she found herself wondering if knowledge could be too dangerous to possess. Harry Potter was trapped with a piece of Voldemort's soul, and according to everything she'd read, there was no way to save him without destroying the very thing that made him who he was. The fragment had been part of him for so long that removing it would be like trying to separate his shadow from his body. But Luna had seen enough impossible things in her life to know that sometimes the impossible was simply a problem that hadn't found the right solution yet. Her mother had always said that magic was bigger than any one wizard's understanding of it, and that the greatest discoveries came from those brave enough to question what everyone else accepted as fact. Luna picked up her quill again and wrote one final note in her journal. The subject believes he is alone in this struggle. He has no idea that he's carrying a fragment of Voldemort's soul, and he seems to have no one who understands the nature of his burden. This isolation may be making the fragment stronger. Despair and loneliness appear to feed it just as much as anger does. She closed the journal and tucked it under her pillow, already planning the next day's observations. Tomorrow, she would try talking to Hermione Granger. If anyone might have theories about soul magic or Harry's unusual experiences, it would be the brightest witch of her age. Luna settled into bed, but sleep was slow to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that writhing darkness around Harry's scar, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The fragment was growing stronger. She was certain of that now, and eventually it would reach a point where it could overpower Harry's own soul entirely. When that happened, Harry Potter would cease to exist, and something far more terrible would take his place. Luna pulled her blankets up to her chin and tried not to think about what Voldemort could accomplish with a body that everyone trusted, in a school full of children who had no idea that their hero had become their greatest threat. But mostly, she tried not to think about how utterly alone Harry must feel, carrying such darkness inside himself without anyone to understand or help him bear the weight of it. Because Luna Lovegood knew what it was like to carry terrible knowledge in solitude, and she wouldn't wish that burden on her worst enemy, let alone on a boy who had already sacrificed so much for the wizarding world's safety. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of helping Harry understand what he was fighting, and perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, she might even find a way to help him win. Chapter 3. The Weight of Knowing. Luna spent the better part of 3 days planning exactly how to tell Harry Potter that he was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul in his forehead. It was not the sort of conversation one could approach casually, and Luna had learned from bitter experience that devastating truths required careful handling if they were to be received rather than rejected. She considered and discarded dozens of approaches. She could ease into it gradually, building up to the revelation over weeks of careful conversations. She could present it as academic theory, allowing Harry to draw his own conclusions. She could even try approaching Ron or Hermione first, using them as intermediaries to soften the blow. But each approach carried its own risks, and Luna found herself returning again and again to the uncomfortable truth that some revelations could only be delivered directly, with all the pain that such honesty required. She also knew that time was not on their side. The fragment around Harry's scar had grown more active over the past few days, responding to every stress and frustration with increasing intensity. Luna had watched it pulse and writhe during meals, during classes, during the quiet moments between conversations when Harry thought no one was looking. It was feeding on his emotional turmoil, growing stronger with each passing day, and Luna was beginning to fear what might happen if it reached some critical threshold of power. The opportunity she'd been waiting for came on Thursday evening, when Luna spotted Harry leaving the great hall alone after dinner, his shoulders set with the particular tension that meant he was fighting off one of his headaches. Through her spectre specs, she could see the fragment around his scar, writhing with malevolent energy, and she knew that whatever vision or connection was plaguing him tonight was stronger than usual. Luna followed at a discreet distance, watching as Harry made his way through the corridors with the determined stride of someone seeking solitude. She wasn't surprised when he stopped in front of the blank stretch of wall on the 7th floor, where the room of requirement would appear for those who needed it most. She waited until Harry had disappeared inside before approaching the wall herself, focusing her thoughts on what she needed. A place where two people could speak honestly about terrible truths without fear of interruption or discovery. The door that appeared was simple and unadorned, opening into a small, comfortable room that reminded Luna of the sitting area in her father's study. Soft armchairs flanked a modest fireplace, and the walls were lined with books that seemed to pulse gently with their own inner light. It was a space designed for difficult conversations and the comfort that such conversations required. Harry was seated in one of the armchairs, his head in his hands, and his breathing carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was fighting against considerable pain. The fragment around his scar was more active than Luna had ever seen it, writhing and pulsing with an energy that seemed almost eager, as though it were feeding on Harry's distress with particular satisfaction. "Hello, Harry," Luna said softly, settling into the chair across from him. Harry looked up, startled, and Luna could see the effort it cost him to focus on her face. His green eyes were shadowed with pain and exhaustion, and there was a brittleness to his expression that spoke of defenses worn dangerously thin. "Luna," he said, his voice hoarse. "How did you—" "Never mind. I should go. I don't want anyone to see me like this." "Like what?" Luna asked gently. "In pain? Struggling with something that no one else understands? There's no shame in that, Harry." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You don't understand. No one understands. I'm seeing things, feeling things that aren't real, and I can't make it stop." "What if they are real?" Luna asked, adjusting her spectre specs so she could observe the fragment more clearly. "What if the things you're seeing and feeling are exactly what they appear to be?" "That's even worse," Harry said, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. "Because if they're real, then I'm connected to him somehow, to Voldemort. And that means—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to voice whatever terrible conclusion he'd reached. Luna watched the fragment pulse with what she was beginning to recognize as satisfaction, feeding on Harry's fear and self-recrimination. "Harry," Luna said, her voice steady and calm, "I need to tell you something. Something important. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to everything I have to say before you respond." Harry lowered his hands, studying her with the wary attention of someone who had learned to expect the worst from important conversations. "What are you talking about?" "Promise me," Luna insisted gently. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but it's the truth, and you deserve to know it." Harry stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the urge to flee rather than face whatever revelation Luna was preparing to share. But finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I promise." Luna took a deep breath, removing her spectre specs and setting them carefully on the small table between their chairs. Without the magical enhancement, Harry looked perfectly normal, tired and stressed, but utterly human. It was only through the spectre specs that she could see the terrible truth wrapped around his scar, like a living shadow. "Harry," she began, choosing her words with deliberate care. "When I look at you through my spectre specs, I see something that shouldn't be there. Something dark and foreign that's attached to your scar." Harry's hand rose instinctively to his forehead, his fingers tracing the lightning bolt shape that had marked him since infancy. "What do you mean, attached?" "I mean, there's a piece of something else living in your head," Luna said, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "Something that writhes and pulses and grows stronger when you're angry or afraid. Something that has its own agenda, its own intelligence, its own hunger." Harry went very still, his face draining of color as Luna's words sank in. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "I've been researching soul magic," Luna continued, putting her spectre specs back on so she could observe Harry's reaction and the fragment's response. "And I've discovered that when a wizard commits murder, it tears their soul apart. These fragments can be preserved in objects, creating what are called horcruxes. But in rare cases, a soul fragment can attach itself to a living being instead." The fragment around Harry's scar had gone completely motionless, as though it were listening to Luna's explanation with the same horrified attention as Harry himself. "You're saying I'm a horcrux," Harry said, his voice flat and mechanical. It wasn't a question. "I'm saying you're carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul," Luna replied, watching as Harry's face went from pale to ashen. "It happened the night he tried to kill you as a baby. When his curse rebounded, a fragment of his soul tore loose and attached itself to you. You've been carrying it ever since." Harry stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small room with sharp, jerky movements. The fragment around his scar pulsed with increasing agitation, feeding on his emotional turmoil. "No," Harry said, his voice rising. "No, that's insane. I can't be. I'm not." "You are," Luna said firmly but gently. "And it explains everything, Harry. The way your scar hurts when Voldemort is angry, the visions you see through his eyes, the voice you sometimes hear in your head telling you to do terrible things." Harry stopped pacing, spinning to face her with wild eyes. "How do you know about the voice?" "Because I can see it," Luna said simply. "When you're stressed or angry, the fragment becomes active. It writhes and pulses and grows stronger. And sometimes, for just a moment, I can see something that looks almost like a face in the shadows around your scar. Something with red eyes and a mouth that moves as though it's speaking." Harry collapsed back into his chair as though his legs could no longer support him. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, it's true, isn't it? I really am carrying him inside my head." The fragment around his scar was pulsing rapidly now, almost frantically, and Luna realized that Harry's growing despair was feeding it more powerfully than his anger ever had. She moved to the chair beside him, reaching out to take his trembling hands in hers. "Yes," she said quietly. "But you're not him, Harry. You're not becoming him. You're fighting him every single day just by being yourself." "How can you say that?" Harry demanded, tears streaming down his face. "How can you say I'm not becoming him when he's literally inside my head? When I can feel him sometimes, pressing against my thoughts, trying to make me do things I don't want to do." "Because," Luna said, her voice steady and sure, "if you were becoming him, you wouldn't be crying right now. You wouldn't be horrified by this revelation. You'd be pleased. You'd see it as an opportunity rather than a curse." Harry looked at her through his tears, and Luna could see him struggling to process not just the revelation itself, but the implications of how she'd delivered it. "You've known," he said, his voice hollow. "This whole time, you've been watching me, and you've known what I am." "I've known what you're carrying," Luna corrected gently. "But Harry, what you're carrying isn't what you are. You're not a horcrux that happens to look like Harry Potter. You're Harry Potter who happens to be carrying a horcrux. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harry asked, his voice breaking. "Because I don't know where I end and it begins anymore. I don't know which thoughts are mine and which ones are his. I don't know if the anger I feel is real or if it's just the fragment feeding on itself." Luna squeezed his hands, watching as the fragment around his scar reacted to the physical contact with what looked like revulsion. It seemed to shrink away from her touch, and Luna filed that observation away for future consideration. "The anger you feel about injustice is yours," she said firmly. "The way you protect people who can't protect themselves is yours. The love you feel for your friends, the grief you carry for your parents, the desperate desire to be normal, all of that is yours, Harry. The fragment can influence your emotions, but it can't create them from nothing." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and Luna could see him wrestling with the urge to believe her against the terrible certainty that he was fundamentally corrupted by what he carried. "How do you know?" he whispered. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been watching you for weeks," Luna said, "and I've seen how the fragment reacts to different emotions. It feeds on anger, fear, despair, all the dark emotions that make you feel isolated and alone. But when you laugh, when you're kind to someone, when you show love or loyalty or hope, the fragment grows smaller. It hates those emotions because they're purely yours, and they weaken its hold on you." As if to demonstrate her point, Luna leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to Harry's forehead, just above his scar. The fragment recoiled from the contact so violently that Luna could see it writhing in what looked like pain. "It can't touch you when you remember who you really are," she murmured against his skin. "It can only influence you when you forget." Harry broke down completely then, sobbing into Luna's shoulder as 15 years of confusion, fear, and self-doubt poured out of him. Luna held him while he cried, one hand stroking his hair and the other resting firmly on his back, anchoring him to the present moment and to his own essential humanity. Through her spectre specs, she watched the fragment around his scar grow smaller and dimmer as Harry released some of the toxic emotions that had been feeding it. This was good, she realized. This breakdown, as painful as it was actually starving the fragment of the negative energy it needed to maintain its influence. "I'm so tired," Harry whispered against her shoulder. "I'm so tired of fighting something I can't see or understand. I'm tired of feeling like I'm going crazy." "You're not going crazy," Luna said firmly. "You're carrying an impossible burden with no help and no understanding of what you're fighting. Anyone would struggle under those circumstances." "But now you know," Harry said, pulling back to look at her with red-rimmed eyes. "And that means—" "God, Luna. That means I've put you in danger, just by being near you. If Voldemort ever finds out that someone knows—" "Then we'll make sure he doesn't find out," Luna said simply. "This will be our secret, Harry. Yours and mine. And we'll figure out how to help you manage it together." Harry shook his head. "You don't understand. There might not be a way to manage it. From what I've read about Horcruxes, the only way to destroy them is to destroy the container. And if I'm the container, then we'll find another way," Luna said with quiet determination. "Magic is bigger than any one wizard's understanding of it, Harry. Just because no one has found a solution yet doesn't mean one doesn't exist." "You really believe that?" Harry asked, his voice carrying a desperate hope that made Luna's heart ache. "I really believe that," she confirmed. "And I believe that you're worth fighting for, worth saving, worth every risk and every sacrifice it might take to find that solution." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and Luna could see something shifting in his expression. Surprise giving way to gratitude, gratitude giving way to something deeper and more complex. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why are you willing to take this on? You could just pretend you never saw anything, go back to your normal life, and never have to worry about any of this." Luna considered the question seriously, because Harry deserved a thoughtful answer rather than a pat reassurance. "Because," she said finally, "I know what it's like to carry terrible knowledge alone. After my mother died, I could see things that others couldn't. Thestrals, the emotional auras around people, the way death leaves marks on the living. For years I thought I was going mad. And I know how isolating it is to experience something that no one else can see or understand." She paused, adjusting her spectre specs so she could observe the fragment's reaction to her words. It had settled into a dull, sullen pulse, no longer feeding on Harry's emotional turmoil. "But mostly," Luna continued, "I'm doing this because I can see what you're fighting, and I can see that you're winning. Every day that you choose kindness over cruelty, every moment that you protect someone else instead of yourself, every time you laugh or love or hope, You're proving that you're stronger than the darkness you carry." "I don't feel strong," Harry said quietly. "Strength isn't about feeling invincible," Luna replied. "It's about continuing to fight, even when you're afraid. And Harry, you've been fighting a piece of the darkest wizard in history since you were a baby, and you're still here. You're still yourself. You're still choosing to be good. That's not weakness, that's heroism." Harry looked down at his hands, which had finally stopped shaking. "What happens now?" he asked. What do we do with this knowledge?" "We learn," Luna said simply. "We figure out how the fragment affects you, what makes it stronger, what makes it weaker. We develop strategies for managing its influence, and we research everything we can about soul magic and Horcrux removal. And if we can't find a way to remove it safely?" Luna met his eyes steadily. "Then we find a way to live with it that doesn't involve you sacrificing your life for other people's convenience." Harry blinked, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "Luna, no," she said, cutting him off. "I won't accept that you have to die just because someone else made you into their Horcrux without your consent. There has to be another way, and we're going to find it." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them processing the weight of what had been shared and what lay ahead. Through her spectre specs, Luna watched the fragment around Harry's scar settle into its most dormant state she'd ever observed, as though their conversation had somehow satisfied it or convinced it to retreat. "We'll need a way to communicate about this," Luna said eventually. "Some kind of code that won't attract attention if other people overhear." Harry nodded, his analytical mind already engaging with the practical aspects of their situation. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," Luna said thoughtfully, "we could talk about it as though it's a pet. Something you're caring for that has behavioral problems." Despite everything, Harry managed a weak smile. "A pet?" "Right. So when the fragment is active, your pet is having a bad day," Luna supplied. "When it's dormant, your pet is sleeping peacefully. If we need to meet urgently because something concerning is happening, you can tell me your pet is sick and needs attention. And if we just want to talk about research or management strategies?" "Training sessions," Luna said with satisfaction. "We're working on training your pet to behave better." Harry actually laughed at that, a sound that made the fragment around his scar pulse with what looked like irritation. Only you would think of discussing a piece of Voldemort's soul in terms of pet training. "It's not that different, really," Luna mused. "Both involve understanding behavioral patterns, establishing boundaries, and providing appropriate consequences for unwanted actions." They spent another hour working out the details of their arrangement, when and where they would meet, how they would communicate in public, what research priorities they should focus on first. By the time they left the room of requirement, they had established the framework for what Luna privately thought of as the most important partnership of her life. As they walked back toward their respective dormitories, Harry caught Luna's arm gently. "Luna," he said, his voice serious. "Thank you. For seeing me, for believing in me, for not running away when you found out what I am." Luna turned to face him fully, removing her spectre specs so he could see her eyes clearly. "Harry Potter," she said with quiet intensity, "what you are is a brave, kind, remarkable person who has been fighting an impossible battle with grace and determination. The fact that you're also carrying a Horcrux is just another challenge to overcome, not a fundamental change in who you are." Harry stared at her for a moment, and Luna could see him struggling to internalize her words, to believe them despite everything his fears were telling him. "I hope you're right," he said finally. "I'm always right," Luna said with mock seriousness. "It's one of my most annoying qualities." Harry laughed again, and this time the sound was lighter, more genuine. The fragment around his scar remained sullen and dim, weakened by the hope and connection that Harry was allowing himself to feel. That night, Luna lay in her bed, writing in her journal, while her roommates slept peacefully around her. But tonight's entry was different from her clinical observations and research notes. Tonight, she wrote about the weight of sharing terrible knowledge and the relief of no longer carrying it alone. The subject now knows the truth about his condition, she wrote. Initial reaction was shock and despair, as expected. However, he demonstrated remarkable resilience and acceptance once the initial revelation was processed. More importantly, the subject appears to derive strength from having someone who understands his situation and believes in his ability to overcome it. Luna paused, thinking about the way Harry's entire demeanor had changed once he realized he wasn't facing this alone. Hypothesis: isolation and self-doubt may be key factors in the Fragment's ability to influence the host. By providing understanding, support, and hope, we may be able to significantly weaken the Fragment's hold without requiring its physical removal. She set down her quill and removed her spectre specs, but for once, her tired eyes didn't dwell on the terrible things she'd seen that day. Instead, she thought about Harry's smile when he'd laughed about pet training, about the way his shoulders had relaxed when he realized he didn't have to carry his burden alone anymore. Luna Lovegood had spent most of her life seeing things that others missed, understanding truths that others couldn't perceive. But tonight, she'd discovered something new. Sometimes the most important thing you could see was not the darkness that threatened to consume someone, but the light that refused to be extinguished despite everything. And Harry Potter, Horcrux or not, carried more light than anyone she'd ever known. Chapter 4. Hidden Conversations. The first thing Luna taught Harry was how to breathe. It seemed like such a simple thing. Breathing was, after all, something he'd been doing quite successfully for 15 years without instruction. But sitting in the room of requirement 3 days after their devastating conversation, Luna showed him that there was a difference between breathing to survive and breathing to find peace. "Close your eyes," she said, settling cross-legged on the soft carpet the room had provided, "and focus only on the air moving in and out of your lungs. Count each breath. When thoughts intrude, acknowledge them gently and let them drift away like clouds across the sky." Harry tried to follow her instructions, but his mind kept wandering to the fragment he now knew was coiled around his scar. Through her spectre specs, Luna could see his agitation manifesting in the restless writhing of the dark thing, feeding on his inability to find calm. "It's harder when you know it's there, isn't it?" Luna observed quietly. "Now that you're aware of the fragment, you're hyper-conscious of every emotion, every thought, wondering which ones belong to you and which ones belong to it." Harry opened his eyes, frustration evident in his expression. "Exactly. How am I supposed to meditate when I keep wondering if my inability to concentrate is my own impatience, or if it's the fragment making me agitated?" "The fragment doesn't want you to find peace," Luna said, adjusting her spectre specs to observe the dark thing more closely. "Peace starves it of the negative emotions it feeds on. So yes, some of your agitation is probably the fragment trying to prevent you from learning these techniques." "That's deeply unsettling," Harry said, running a hand through his hair. "But also hopeful," Luna countered. "If the fragment is actively trying to prevent you from learning to meditate, that means meditation works. It means we're on the right path." Luna could see Harry processing this logic, his analytical mind finding comfort in the reasoning, even as his emotions remained turbulent. She guided him through several more breathing exercises, watching as the fragment gradually settled into a duller, less active state. "There," she said with satisfaction. "See how much calmer it looks now. The fragment thrives on chaos and emotional turmoil. When you achieve even a moment of inner peace, it weakens." Harry opened his eyes again, and Luna could see surprise in his expression. "I do feel different. Not completely peaceful, but less like there's a storm raging in my head." "That's excellent progress for your first session," Luna said warmly. With practice, you'll be able to achieve that state more quickly and maintain it for longer periods. They spent the next hour developing what Luna privately thought of as their secret vocabulary. Harry needed to be able to communicate with her about the Fragment's activity without arousing suspicion from classmates or professors, and Luna needed to understand the subtle signs that indicated when Harry was struggling. When the Fragment is particularly active, Harry said, thinking through their system, I'll mention that my pet is restless. If it's causing me physical pain, the way my scar burns during visions, I'll say my pet isn't feeling well. And if you're having trouble distinguishing between your own thoughts and the Fragment's influence, Luna asked. Harry considered this. I'll say my pet is being difficult to train. That covers both the psychological confusion and the need for extra help managing it. Luna nodded approvingly. What about during classes or meals when we can't talk freely? We need signals that won't be noticed by others. They settled on a system of subtle gestures. Harry touching his temple meant the Fragment was active, rubbing his neck meant he needed to talk privately, and adjusting his glasses indicated he was struggling with a vision or connection to Voldemort. Luna would respond with her own signals. Touching her earrings meant she understood and would meet him at their usual spot. Playing with her necklace indicated they should wait until later, and removing her spectre specs entirely meant immediate danger and the need for emergency measures. This feels very spy-like, Harry observed with a weak smile. Secret codes and clandestine meetings. Well, Luna said thoughtfully, in a way we are spies. We're gathering intelligence about the Fragment's behavior and developing strategies to undermine its influence. The only difference is that the enemy is inside your head rather than in another country. Harry's smile faded. Sometimes I wonder if there's really a difference between me and the Fragment anymore. After carrying it for 15 years, how can I be sure where I end and it begins? Luna had been expecting this question. It was a natural progression of Harry's growing awareness of his condition. She'd spent considerable time thinking about how to address his fears without dismissing their validity. Do you remember the last time you helped someone without expecting anything in return? She asked. Harry looked puzzled by the apparent non sequitur. Yesterday, I suppose. I helped Neville find his dropped remember-all after potions. And when you helped him, how did you feel? Good, I suppose. Satisfied. Like I'd done the right thing. Could you see the Fragment through my spectre specs in that moment? It actually shrank, Luna said. Kindness weakens it. Compassion starves it. Love makes it writhe in what appears to be pain. So when you help people, when you feel genuine care for others, when you choose to be gentle instead of cruel, that's all you, Harry. That's the part of yourself that the Fragment can't touch or corrupt. Harry stared at her for a moment. You've really been watching it that closely? I've been watching you that closely, Luna corrected gently. The Fragment is just one aspect of what I observe. I also see the way your face lights up when you successfully help someone learn a new spell. I see the careful way you handle injured creatures in care of magical creatures. I see how you always make sure the younger students are safe before you worry about your own welfare. And the Fragment never influences those behaviors? Never, Luna said firmly. If anything, it tries to suppress them. Every act of kindness you perform is an act of rebellion against the darkness you carry. Harry was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Through her spectre specs, Luna watched the Fragment around his scar settle into an almost dormant state as he allowed himself to accept the hope her words offered. I've been reading about protective charms, Luna said, changing the subject to give Harry time to absorb what they'd discussed. She pulled a slim book from her bag, one of the texts she'd borrowed from the deepest corners of the library. There are mental exercises that can help shield your thoughts from external influence. External influence, Harry repeated. Is that what the Fragment is? External. Luna considered this carefully. I think it's more accurate to say it's foreign. It's part of you now in a physical sense, but it doesn't share your values, your memories, or your essential nature. It's like having a parasite that mimics some of your brain functions without actually being your brain. Harry shuddered. That's a disturbing analogy. But an accurate one, Luna said. And just like with any parasite, there are ways to limit its influence and strengthen your own natural defenses. She guided Harry through several mental exercises designed to create psychological barriers around his core self. The techniques were drawn from a variety of magical traditions, some from ancient wizarding meditation practices, others from more recent research into magical psychology and mind healing. Imagine a bright light at the center of your being, Luna instructed. This light represents everything that is essentially you, your memories, your values, your love for the people who matter to you. The fragment exists in the darkness around this light, but it cannot touch the light itself. Harry followed her guidance, and Luna watched through her spectre specs as something remarkable happened. The fragment around his scar didn't disappear, but it seemed to pull back, creating a small buffer zone around Harry's forehead that hadn't been there before. "Excellent," Luna breathed. "You're creating psychic distance between yourself and the fragment. This is exactly what we want to achieve." They practiced the visualization for another 20 minutes until Harry could maintain the mental barrier without conscious effort. By the end of the session, the fragment had retreated to what Luna suspected was its most dormant state in years. "I feel clearer," Harry said, as they prepared to leave the room of requirement. "Like there's more space in my head for my own thoughts." "That's because there is," Luna said, packing her books and notes. "You're reclaiming territory that the fragment had encroached upon. With practice, you'll be able to expand that clear space even more." As they walked back toward their respective dormitories, Harry caught Luna's arm gently. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the first time since I learned what I'm carrying, I feel like there might actually be hope." Luna smiled, adjusting her spectre specs. "There's always hope, Harry. Sometimes we just need help seeing it." The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Luna and Harry met every other evening in the room of requirement, working on meditation techniques and mental exercises, while Luna continued her research into soul magic and protective charms. During meals and classes, they communicated through their subtle signal system, allowing Luna to monitor the fragment's activity and provide guidance when Harry needed it. The system proved its value during a particularly difficult defense against the dark arts lesson, when Umbridge forced the class to read aloud from the Ministry's approved textbook on theoretical defensive magic, a Ministry perspective. Harry's barely concealed rage at the woman's deliberate sabotage of their education made the fragment pulse with increasing intensity. Luna caught his eye from across the classroom and touched her earrings, the signal that she saw what was happening and understood. Harry responded by rubbing his neck, indicating he needed help managing the fragment's activity. Luna began a series of subtle mental exercises she'd taught him, using tiny gestures to guide him through the breathing techniques that would calm both his emotions and the fragment's response. By the end of class, Harry had successfully prevented the fragment from reaching the level of agitation that typically triggered his headaches or visions. It was a small victory, but an important one. "Your pet seems much better behaved lately," Luna observed as they walked to lunch together. "The training sessions are helping," Harry agreed, using their coded language even though the corridor was relatively empty. "I'm starting to understand its behavioral patterns better." "Consistency is key with difficult animals," Luna said sagely. "The more predictable our responses become, the less power they have to surprise or upset us." Ron, who had been walking slightly ahead of them, turned around with a confused expression. "Are you two talking about pets? Since when do either of you have pets?" Harry and Luna exchanged a quick glance. They'd known this moment would come eventually. Their friends were too observant not to notice the change in Harry's behavior and his sudden friendship with Luna. "It's a theoretical pet," Luna said in her most dreamy voice. We've been discussing the proper care and training of imaginary magical creatures for an independent research project. A theoretical pet, Ron repeated slowly, as though testing the words for sense. For magical creatures class, Harry added, hoping to make their story sound more plausible. We're studying how different magical animals respond to various training techniques. Ron still looked skeptical, but Hermione appeared at his elbow before he could ask more questions. That sounds fascinating, she said, though her sharp eyes moved between Harry and Luna with obvious curiosity. What sort of creature are you studying? Luna smiled serenely. Something quite rare and poorly understood. Most people can't even see them properly, which makes research challenging. Oh, Hermione said, her expression shifting to polite interest, mixed with mild disappointment. Another one of your father's creatures, then? Something like that, Luna agreed, and Harry marveled at her ability to mislead without technically lying, but Harry could see the questions forming in Hermione's intelligent eyes, and he knew they would need to be more careful about their public interactions. The last thing they needed was for Ron and Hermione to start investigating their supposed research project. That evening, Harry found himself in the unusual position of genuinely looking forward to one of Professor Umbridge's detentions, not because he enjoyed writing lines with the blood quill that carved words into his hand, but because the physical pain provided an interesting test of the mental techniques Luna had been teaching him. As he sat in Umbridge's office, repeatedly writing, "I must not tell lies," while the magical quill sliced the words into his skin, Harry focused on the bright light visualization Luna had taught him. He imagined the core of himself as something separate from the pain, untouchable and pure. The technique worked remarkably well. While the physical discomfort was still considerable, Harry found he could observe it with a kind of detached awareness that prevented it from overwhelming him. More importantly, through their previous practice sessions, Harry had learned to recognize the difference between his own natural response to pain and the Fragment's attempts to use that pain to feed its own strength. When the Fragment tried to transform his justified anger at Umbridge's cruelty into something darker and more consuming, Harry was able to redirect his emotions toward protective thoughts, concern for other students who might face similar treatment, determination to help them avoid such punishment, hope for the day when Umbridge's reign would end. The Fragment hated these thoughts. Harry could feel it shrinking away from his deliberate focus on protecting others rather than seeking revenge. By the time Umbridge dismissed him, Harry felt something approaching triumph. He'd successfully prevented the Fragment from turning his suffering into fuel for its own purposes. Instead, he'd used the experience to strengthen his own resolve and compassion. Luna was waiting for him in the corridor outside Umbridge's office, her spectre specs glinting in the torchlight. "How did your training session go?" she asked quietly as they walked toward the moving staircases. "Better than expected," Harry said, flexing his bandaged hand. "I think I'm starting to understand how to starve it instead of feeding it." Luna smiled, adjusting her spectre specs to observe the Fragment around his scar. "Yes, I can see that. It looks quite sullen and diminished. Well done." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the point where their paths diverged. Harry toward Gryffindor Tower, Luna toward Ravenclaw. But as Harry turned to bid her good night, Luna caught his sleeve gently. "Harry," she said, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. Are you happy that I can see it? The Fragment, I mean. Sometimes I wonder if knowing makes everything worse for you." Harry turned to face her fully, studying her expression in the flickering torchlight. He could see genuine worry in her pale eyes, and he realized that Luna was carrying her own burden of doubt about their arrangement. "No," he said firmly. "Knowing is better. Having someone who understands is better. Before you told me what I was carrying, I thought I was going mad. I thought the voice in my head, the visions, the way my scar burned. I thought it meant I was becoming something terrible. And now Now I know I'm fighting something terrible, Harry said. And that's completely different from being something terrible. The fragment is the enemy, not me. I never understood that before. Luna's expression brightened, some of the worry leaving her eyes. Good, she said softly. Because I rather like who you are when you're just yourself, without the fragment's influence clouding your thoughts. I rather like who I am when I'm with you too, Harry admitted. You see me more clearly than anyone else ever has. They stood there for a moment, both recognizing that something important had been acknowledged between them. Through her spectre specs, Luna could see that the fragment around Harry's scar had gone completely still, as though their mutual understanding created an environment too peaceful for it to function properly. Sleep well, Harry, Luna said eventually. And remember, if your pet has nightmares tonight, those aren't your dreams. They're just noise from something that doesn't belong in your head. Harry nodded, already mentally preparing to use the visualization techniques if the fragment tried to disturb his rest with visions or uncomfortable dreams. Good night, Luna, he said. Thank you for helping me reclaim my own mind. As Harry climbed through the portrait hole into Gryffindor Common Room, he found Ron and Hermione waiting for him by the dying fire. Ron looked up from his charms homework with concern evident on his face. How was detention? He asked. Umbridge didn't use that awful quill again, did she? Harry glanced down at his bandaged hand. She did, but it wasn't as bad as usual. I've been learning some meditation techniques. They help with pain management. Meditation techniques? Hermione repeated, her eyebrows rising. Since when are you interested in meditation? Since I realized that letting Umbridge get to me was exactly what she wanted, Harry said, settling into one of the armchairs. Getting angry just gives her more satisfaction. Staying calm is a better form of resistance. Hermione and Ron exchanged a look that Harry recognized. They were worried about him, concerned that his recent changes in behavior indicated some new problem they needed to solve. Harry, Hermione said carefully, you've been different lately. I don't know. More distant. You disappear for hours at a time. You're spending time with Luna Lovegood of all people. And now you're talking about meditation and theoretical pets. Are you all right? Harry considered how to answer. He couldn't tell them the truth, but he owed them some explanation for his changed behavior. I've been thinking about what Sirius said, he said finally. About how the world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters. About how everyone has light and dark inside them, and how we choose which to act on. This was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. I've been trying to understand my own darkness better, Harry continued. The anger, the desire for revenge, the way I sometimes want to hurt people who hurt others. I realized that if I don't learn to manage those impulses, I might become exactly what Voldemort wants me to become. Ron and Hermione looked stunned by this level of self-reflection from Harry, who had never been particularly introspective about his emotional responses to conflict. So you've been learning meditation, Hermione said slowly, and talking to Luna because she's good at seeing things from unusual perspectives, Harry added. She's helping me understand the difference between justified anger and destructive rage. This was also true, though the reality was far more complex than Harry could explain. That's actually quite mature, Hermione said, sounding surprised. I never thought of Luna as particularly wise, but I suppose she does have a unique way of looking at things. She's much more perceptive than people give her credit for, Harry said. Just because she believes in Nargles doesn't mean she can't see truths that others miss. Ron still looked confused by the entire conversation, but he seemed reassured that Harry was actively working on his problems rather than simply suffering through them. Well, he said finally, as long as you're not planning to become one of those people who only eat vegetables and speak in riddles about the cosmic significance of garden gnomes. Harry laughed, and the sound was genuinely warm and relaxed. No promises about the vegetables, but I'll try to keep the cosmic riddles to a minimum. Later that night, as Harry lay in his bed listening to his dorm mates sleep peacefully around him, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. For the first time in years, he felt like he had some measure of control over his own mind and emotions. The fragment was still there. He doubted it would ever be completely gone, but it no longer felt like an overwhelming presence threatening to consume his identity. More importantly, he no longer felt alone in his struggle. Luna saw him clearly, understood his burden, and believed unwaveringly in his ability to overcome it. Having someone who knew the worst thing about him and still saw him as fundamentally good was a gift Harry had never expected to receive. As sleep began to claim him, Harry used the visualization techniques Luna had taught him to surround his dreams with protective light. The fragment tried to intrude with visions of darkness and violence, but Harry's mental barriers held firm, and he slept peacefully through the night for the first time in months. In Ravenclaw Tower, Luna sat by her window writing in her journal, documenting the day's progress and observations. But tonight, her clinical notes were interspersed with more personal reflections on the weight of sharing such dangerous knowledge. "The subject is responding well to meditation and visualization techniques," she wrote. "Fragment activity has decreased significantly during practice sessions and remains diminished for several hours afterward. However, the emotional burden of keeping this secret from his closest friends is beginning to affect both of us." Luna paused, thinking about the careful way she and Harry had to navigate every conversation with Ron and Hermione. Hypothesis: the secrecy required by our situation may create its own form of stress that could potentially feed the fragment. However, the alternative, revealing the truth to others, carries even greater risks. For now, the benefits of our arrangement clearly outweigh the costs. She set down her quill and removed her spectre specs, but found herself staring out at the moonlit grounds rather than preparing for sleep. Caring for Harry had become the central focus of her life, and while she didn't regret that choice, she sometimes wondered if she was strong enough to bear the weight of such responsibility. But then she thought about Harry's smile when he'd successfully managed the fragment during detention, about the way his shoulders had relaxed as he learned to distinguish between his own emotions and the fragment's influence, about the hope in his voice when he spoke about reclaiming his own mind. Luna Lovegood had spent most of her life seeing things that others couldn't see, understanding truths that others couldn't comprehend. For the first time, that gift was being used to heal rather than simply observe, and that made every moment of worry and fear worthwhile. Tomorrow, they would continue their work together, two unlikely allies against one of the darkest forms of magic ever created. And slowly, carefully, they were winning. Chapter 5. The Fragment's Voice. The voice came to Harry for the first time on a Tuesday morning during Transfiguration, whispering through his thoughts with the cold precision of a blade sliding between ribs. "You cannot hide from me forever, boy." Harry's quill snapped in his grip, sending droplets of ink spattering across his parchment. The voice was unmistakably Voldemort's, that high, cold tone that had haunted Harry's nightmares for years, but it was coming from inside his own head rather than through a vision or dream. Professor McGonagall was explaining the theoretical principles behind human transfiguration, her voice steady and authoritative as she drew complex diagrams on the blackboard. Around Harry, his classmates took careful notes, completely unaware that the boy beside them was having his first direct conversation with the most dangerous dark wizard in history. "She cannot protect you," the voice continued, and Harry realized with mounting horror that it was referring to Luna. "The strange girl who thinks she can see me. I know what you have been doing, what you have been learning. Did you think meditation and breathing exercises could keep me at bay forever?" Harry forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression neutral, even as panic clawed at his chest. Through their previous sessions, Luna had taught him that strong emotional reactions fed the fragment's power, but knowing this intellectually was very different from maintaining calm when Voldemort himself was speaking directly into his consciousness. "You feel fear. the voice observed with satisfaction. Good. You should be afraid. You carry a piece of my soul, boy, and that makes you mine whether you accept it or not. Harry carefully set down the broken pieces of his quill and reached for a spare from his bag, using the mundane action to ground himself in physical reality. Luna had taught him that focusing on concrete sensations could help distinguish between his own thoughts and external intrusion. The girl sees me through those ridiculous spectacles of hers, the voice whispered. She believes she can help you, but she has no idea what she is truly facing. I have existed for decades beyond death itself. I have murdered scores of witches and wizards, far more powerful than she. What makes you think a dreamy Ravenclaw girl can stand against Lord Voldemort? Despite every instinct screaming at him to react, to argue, to defend Luna from the voice's contempt, Harry forced himself to begin the mental exercises Luna had taught him. He visualized the bright light at his core, imagined barriers of protective energy around his essential self, and focused on breathing slowly and deliberately. The voice laughed, a sound like ice breaking. Pathetic. You think her amateur techniques can silence me? I am part of you now, woven into your very soul. Every angry thought, every moment of despair, every fear you experience makes me stronger, and I am already strong enough to speak to you whenever I choose. Harry glanced around the classroom, desperate for some external anchor to reality. His eyes found Hermione, bent over her notes with characteristic intensity. Ron was doodling on his parchment, probably drawing Quidditch players. Dean and Seamus were whispering about something unrelated to the lesson. Everything looked perfectly normal, utterly mundane. Only Harry could hear the voice of the Dark Lord commenting on his private thoughts. Tell them, the voice suggested with mock helpfulness. Tell them all that you carry a piece of Voldemort's soul in your head. Tell them that I speak to you, that I know their names, their fears, their weaknesses. See how quickly they turn against you when they realize what you really are. Mr. Potter, Professor McGonagall's sharp voice cut through the Fragment's whispers. Perhaps you could share your thoughts on the ethical implications of human transfiguration. Harry looked up, realizing that everyone in the class was staring at him. He'd apparently been sitting motionless for several minutes while the voice spoke, and McGonagall had noticed his distraction. Sorry, Professor. Could you repeat the question? McGonagall's eyebrows rose, and Harry could see concern beneath her stern expression. I asked about the ethical considerations that govern the practice of human transfiguration. Given your recent experiences with unauthorized transformations, I thought you might have particular insight. She knows, the voice hissed gleefully. They all suspect that something is wrong with you. They can sense the darkness you carry, even if they cannot name it. Harry forced himself to focus on McGonagall's question, drawing on knowledge from previous lessons to construct a coherent response. Human transfiguration requires explicit consent from the subject, because forced transformation violates the fundamental right to self-determination. The magic also carries risks of permanent psychological damage if performed incorrectly. Precisely, McGonagall said, her tone suggesting relief that Harry was capable of rational thought. The consent requirement exists because human consciousness is complex and fragile. Forced alterations to someone's physical form can result in lasting trauma or identity confusion. Identity confusion, the voice repeated mockingly. How appropriate. Tell me, boy, which parts of your identity are truly yours, and which belong to me? Harry spent the rest of the class fighting to maintain his composure, while the voice provided a running commentary on everything from McGonagall's teaching methods to the personal vulnerabilities of Harry's classmates. By the time the bell rang, Harry felt as though he'd been wrestling with a snake for an hour. He gathered his books with shaking hands and made his way into the corridor, scanning the crowd for Luna's distinctive appearance. She was supposed to be in ancient runes right now, but Harry needed to find her immediately. The voice in his head represented a fundamental change in his situation. and Luna was the only person who would understand the implications. "Running to your protector?" the voice inquired as Harry hurried through the halls. "How touching. But consider this. Every moment you spend with her puts her in greater danger. I grow stronger each day, and eventually I will have enough power to act through you directly. When that happens, do you really want her to be the first person within reach?" Harry stopped walking, the voice's words hitting him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the immediate need to tell Luna about this development that he hadn't considered the possibility that seeking her help might actually endanger her. "Clever boy," the voice purred. "You begin to understand. The more you care about her, the more you want to protect her. And the best way to protect her is to stay away from her entirely." "No," Harry whispered under his breath, earning strange looks from passing students. "You're trying to manipulate me." "Am I?" the voice asked with amusement. "Or am I simply pointing out an uncomfortable truth? You know what I am capable of, what I have done to people who opposed me. Do you really want the girl's death on your conscience?" Harry resumed walking, but his steps were less certain now. The voice was doing exactly what Luna had warned him it would do, using his own protective instincts against him, trying to isolate him from the support system that weakened its influence. But the alternative, continuing to meet with Luna while knowing that the fragment could potentially act through him, felt like a betrayal of everything he claimed to care about. Harry found Luna in the library during her free period, seated at their usual table with several books open around her. She looked up as he approached, and he watched her expression shift from welcome to concern as she took in his appearance. "Your pet is having a very bad day," she observed quietly, using their coded language even though the surrounding tables were empty. "Worse than that," Harry said, settling into the chair across from her. "It's learned to talk." Luna's eyes widened behind her spectre specs, and Harry could see her immediately grasping the significance of what he'd said. She glanced around the library, confirming that they were out of earshot of other students, before leaning forward intently. "Tell me everything," she said. "What did it say? When did it start? How did you respond?" Harry recounted the entire experience, from the first whispered words during transfiguration to the voice's attempts to convince him to avoid Luna for her own safety. Luna listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of parchment that she kept carefully angled away from potential observers. "The timing is significant," she said when Harry had finished his account. "Direct communication usually indicates that a soul fragment has reached a critical threshold of power. The fact that it can speak to you coherently suggests that it's becoming more integrated with your consciousness." "More integrated," Harry repeated, feeling sick. "That doesn't sound good." "It's not," Luna said honestly. "But it's also not unexpected. We've been weakening its ability to feed on negative emotions, so it's adapting by trying different tactics. Manipulation through direct communication is actually a sign of desperation." Harry stared at her. Desperation. It felt like it was getting stronger, not weaker. "Think about it logically," Luna said, adjusting her spectre specs to observe the fragment around his scar. "If the fragment were truly in control, it wouldn't need to convince you to stay away from me. It would simply make you do so through direct compulsion. The fact that it's trying to persuade you suggests that it still requires your cooperation to achieve its goals." This interpretation hadn't occurred to Harry, and he felt some of his panic begin to subside as he considered Luna's reasoning. "But what if it's right about the danger?" he asked. "What if I am putting you at risk by being here?" "You are putting me at risk," Luna said matter-of-factly. "But I'm choosing to accept that risk because the alternative, allowing you to face this alone, would virtually guarantee that the fragment eventually succeeds in claiming you entirely." She reached across the table and took his hands in hers, and Harry felt the now familiar sensation of the fragment recoiling from her touch. "Harry," she said seriously, The fragment wants you to believe that you are protecting me by staying away. But isolation is exactly what it needs to grow stronger. Your connection to other people, your love, your loyalty, your desire to help others, these are the things that keep you human. If you let the fragment convince you to sever those connections, you'll be handing it exactly what it wants. Harry looked down at their joined hands, noting how Luna's touch seemed to create a buffer zone around his thoughts that made the fragment's whispers less intrusive. "It knows about you," he said quietly. "It called you the strange girl who thinks she can see me. It knows we've been meeting, knows about the techniques you've been teaching me." "Of course it knows," Luna said. "It shares your memories, your experiences. But knowing about our work and being able to stop it are two different things entirely." Luna opened one of the books she'd been reading and turned it to face Harry. The page showed a detailed diagram of what appeared to be layered magical barriers surrounding a human silhouette. "I've been researching advanced protection techniques," she explained. "There are methods for creating multiple layers of psychic shielding that could potentially block the fragment's ability to communicate directly with your consciousness." Harry studied the diagram, noting the complex runic inscriptions and geometric patterns that surrounded the central figure. "This looks incredibly complicated." "It is," Luna admitted, "and it requires components that will be difficult to obtain. But if we can create even a temporary barrier against the fragment's voice, it might give us insight into more permanent solutions." They spent the next hour going through Luna's research, identifying the materials and techniques they would need to attempt the advanced protection ritual. Some of the required components, like purified moon water and phoenix feather dust, were readily available in the potion supply room. Others, like crystallized unicorn tears and powdered philosopher's stone, would require more creative acquisition methods. "The ritual itself needs to be performed during a new moon for maximum effectiveness," Luna explained. "That gives us 12 days to gather everything we need." "Assuming we can gather everything," Harry said dubiously. "Where exactly do we find crystallized unicorn tears?" "Professor Flitwick keeps a small supply for advanced charm work," Luna said. "I can ask to borrow some for an independent research project. The Philosopher's Stone powder is more challenging, but I believe Professor Snape has a small amount left over from the stone that was destroyed in our first year." Harry grimaced. "Snape's not exactly likely to help me with anything, especially something this unusual." "Which is why I'll be the one asking," Luna said practically. "He's less likely to refuse a Ravenclaw student requesting materials for academic research." As they discussed the logistics of their plan, Harry became aware that the fragment's voice had grown quieter, less insistent. Luna's presence, and their shared focus on constructive action, seemed to weaken its ability to maintain the direct communication it had established earlier. "Enjoy this respite," the voice whispered, so faintly that Harry almost missed it. "But remember that I am always here, always watching, and eventually you will have to choose between your own survival and hers." "It's still talking," Harry said, interrupting Luna's explanation of runic inscription techniques. "Quietly, but it's still there." Luna's expression grew thoughtful. "What is it saying now?" Harry hesitated, reluctant to repeat the fragment's threats against Luna. But he'd learned that hiding information from her only made their situation more dangerous. "It's threatening you," he said quietly, "saying that eventually I'll have to choose between my survival and yours." Rather than looking frightened, Luna appeared almost pleased by this information. "Excellent," she said, making a note on her parchment. "Excellent?" Harry stared at her. "Luna, it's talking about killing you." "It's talking about creating a false dilemma," Luna corrected. "The fragment wants you to believe that your survival and my safety are mutually exclusive. But that's only true if we accept its premise. Our entire approach has been based on finding third options, ways to weaken the fragment without destroying you in the process." Luna adjusted her spectre specs and leaned forward to study Harry's scar more closely. The fact that it's resorting to direct threats suggests that our methods are working better than we realized. A truly powerful fragment wouldn't need to convince you of anything. It would simply act. Her confidence was reassuring, but Harry couldn't shake the memory of the voice's cold certainty. He'd heard Voldemort speak before, had witnessed the Dark Lord's casual cruelty and absolute conviction in his own power. The idea that this was merely desperation rather than genuine threat felt dangerously optimistic. "What if you're wrong?" Harry asked. "What if the fragment really is getting stronger, and it's just biding its time before it tries to hurt you?" Luna was quiet for a moment, and Harry could see her considering the possibility seriously rather than dismissing his concerns. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," she said finally. "But Harry, I need you to understand something. Even if working with me does put me in danger, abandoning you to face this alone would be the worst possible outcome for everyone involved." "How can you say that?" Harry demanded. "If something happened to you because of me, if something happened to me, it would be because I chose to help you, despite the risks," Luna interrupted firmly. "But if the fragment succeeds in isolating you, if it manages to claim your consciousness entirely, then it won't just be me in danger. It will be every person at Hogwarts, every person in the wizarding world, everyone you've ever cared about." Harry felt the weight of this truth settling over him like a heavy cloak. The fragment wasn't just threatening Luna specifically. It was threatening everyone Harry might potentially care about, everyone he might want to protect. The fragment understands that your protective instincts are both your greatest strength and your most exploitable weakness, Luna continued. It will always try to use your desire to keep others safe as a weapon against you. But if you let that fear control your decisions, you'll be playing directly into its hands. Before Harry could respond, the fragment's voice returned with renewed strength and unmistakable hostility. "Enough of this nonsense," it hissed through his thoughts. "You want to protect her? Then prove it. Stand up, walk over to her, put your hands around her throat, and squeeze until she stops speaking her poison." Harry's hands clenched involuntarily, and he felt a surge of violent impulse that was definitely not his own. The fragment was attempting to influence his physical actions directly, trying to use his body to harm Luna while she sat defenseless across from him. "Luna!" Harry said through gritted teeth, his voice strained with the effort of resisting the compulsion. "It's trying to make me hurt you, right now." Instead of moving away or showing fear, Luna leaned forward and placed both of her hands over Harry's clenched fists. The moment she made contact, the violent impulse vanished so completely that Harry gasped with relief. "Fascinating," Luna murmured, studying Harry's expression intently. "Physical contact disrupts its ability to influence your motor functions. That's extremely useful information." "You're taking notes," Harry said incredulously. "It just tried to make me strangle you, and you're taking notes about it." "Of course I'm taking notes," Luna said practically. "This is the first time we've observed the fragment attempting direct physical compulsion. We need to understand exactly how it works so we can develop countermeasures." The fragment's voice returned, now tinged with frustration rather than confidence. "She makes you weak," it snarled. "Every moment you spend with her, every technique she teaches you, every barrier she helps you build, it all makes you weaker, not stronger. You could embrace what you carry, use its power for your own purposes. Instead, you let her convince you to fight against your own nature." "My nature," Harry repeated aloud, causing Luna to look up from her notes. "What's it saying now?" she asked. "That you make me weak, that I should be embracing what I carry instead of fighting it?" Harry met her eyes across the table. "Luna, what if it's right? What if I am supposed to use the fragment's power instead of trying to suppress it?" Luna was quiet for a long moment, and Harry could see her considering the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Power gained through embracing a fragment of Voldemort's soul would come at the cost of everything that makes you who you are," she said finally. "Yes, you might become stronger in a narrow sense, more magically powerful, more willing to use violence, less constrained by empathy or moral considerations. But you wouldn't be Harry Potter anymore. You'd be something else wearing Harry Potter's face. And if that something else could protect the people I care about more effectively than I can, then those people would lose you anyway, Luna said gently. They care about you, Harry, not about some hypothetical version of you with enhanced magical abilities and no moral compass. Saving them by becoming something they couldn't recognize or love wouldn't really be saving them at all. Harry felt the truth of her words settling into his bones, and he watched the fragment's influence recede in response to his renewed certainty about what he was fighting for. Besides, Luna added with a slight smile, I rather like you as you are. Embracing the fragment's power might make you more formidable, but it would also make you considerably less interesting to talk to. Despite everything, Harry laughed. Less interesting. Voldemort is many things, but interesting isn't one of them, Luna said, matter-of-factly. He's powerful, certainly, and frightening, but he's also rather predictable. Power without compassion, intelligence without wisdom, ambition without joy. It's all very one-dimensional. The fragment's voice returned one final time, weaker now but still audible. This is not over, it whispered. I will speak to you again, and eventually you will listen. The girl cannot protect you forever. Then the voice faded entirely, leaving Harry's thoughts mercifully quiet for the first time since Transfiguration class. It's gone, Harry said, slumping back in his chair with exhaustion. For now, Luna agreed, making a final note on her parchment. But this was just the beginning. Direct communication means the fragment is evolving, adapting to our countermeasures. We need to be prepared for it to try other tactics. Luna gathered her books and notes, organizing them with characteristic efficiency. I think it's time we told Professor Dumbledore about what we've discovered, she said quietly. Harry felt his stomach lurch. Tell Dumbledore. Luna, we can't. He'd probably decide that the safest thing would be to lock me up somewhere. Or worse. Or he might have resources and knowledge that we lack, Luna countered. Harry, we've made remarkable progress on our own, but today proved that the fragment is becoming more sophisticated in its attacks. We may have reached the limits of what we can accomplish without adult help. Harry wanted to argue, wanted to insist that they could handle this situation themselves. But the memory of the fragment's attempt to compel him to violence was too fresh, too frightening. What if Luna hadn't been there to break the compulsion? What if the fragment grew strong enough that physical contact wasn't sufficient to disrupt its influence? What if he tries to separate us? Harry asked. What if he decides you're too much of a risk and forbids you from helping me? Luna reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. Then we'll deal with that challenge when it comes. But Harry, the fragment's ability to speak to you directly changes everything. This isn't just about managing its influence anymore. It's about preventing it from gaining enough power to act independently through your body. Harry nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in her argument, even though the prospect of revealing their secret terrified him. When? He asked. Soon, Luna said. I need a few days to organize our research and prepare our case. But we can't wait too long. Every day the fragment has direct access to your consciousness is a day it can learn more about our methods and defenses. As they left the library together, Harry found himself torn between relief at the prospect of adult help and terror at the potential consequences of revelation. But one thing was certain. The fragment's voice had changed the fundamental nature of their struggle, and they could no longer pretend that their amateur efforts would be sufficient to contain a piece of Lord Voldemort's soul. That night, Luna sat in her dormitory, writing in her journal, while her roommates slept around her. But tonight, her clinical observations were interspersed with genuine fear for the first time since she'd begun documenting Harry's condition. The fragment achieved direct verbal communication today, she wrote. This represents a significant escalation in its capabilities and suggests that it is adapting faster than anticipated to our defensive measures. Luna paused, thinking about the moment when the Fragment had tried to compel Harry to violence against her. Most concerning, the Fragment attempted direct motor control during our conversation. Physical contact disrupted this influence, but the implications are alarming. If the Fragment continues to grow stronger, it may eventually overcome even this countermeasure. She set down her quill and stared out at the moonlit grounds, thinking about Harry's question regarding whether they should involve Professor Dumbledore. It was a decision that could save Harry's life or destroy everything they'd worked to build together. Recommendation: consult with Dumbledore within the next few days. While this carries significant risks, the Fragment's evolving capabilities may soon exceed our ability to contain them safely. Luna closed her journal and prepared for bed. But sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the look in Harry's eyes when the Fragment had tried to make him hurt her. The horror, the desperate struggle for control, the fear that he might not be strong enough to resist. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing their case for Dumbledore. Because, despite Harry's fears about adult intervention, Luna was beginning to suspect that their amateur efforts, no matter how well-intentioned, might not be enough to save him from the darkness that was growing stronger inside his own mind. Chapter 6. Dangerous Allies. Luna spent 3 days preparing for what she privately thought of as the most important conversation of her life. She organized their research notes, compiled her observations of the Fragment's behavior, and practiced explaining her unique sight in terms that wouldn't sound like complete madness to someone who'd never experienced magical perception beyond the ordinary. She also spent considerable time watching Professor Dumbledore during meals and staff interactions, using her Spectre Specs to observe the complex layers of his emotional aura. What she saw both reassured and concerned her. Dumbledore radiated genuine care for his students, but that care was wrapped in so many layers of guilt, secrecy, and strategic calculation that Luna sometimes wondered if the man himself knew where his protective instincts ended and his manipulative tendencies began. "He already knows something," Luna told Harry as they prepared to leave for Dumbledore's office on Friday evening. "His emotional emanations change whenever he looks at you. There's recognition there, and fear, and a kind of resigned sadness that suggests he's been dreading a conversation like this." Harry adjusted his robes nervously, checking for the 3rd time that he had the password Dumbledore had given him. That could mean he'll be more receptive to what we're telling him, or it could mean he's already decided how to handle the situation and won't listen to alternatives. "Only one way to find out," Luna said, shouldering her bag of research materials. "Though I should warn you, if he tries to dismiss our findings or suggests that your death is the only solution, I'm not going to remain polite about it." Harry looked at her with a mixture of affection and concern. "Luna, he's the most powerful wizard in Britain. Maybe the world. You can't just argue with him like he's a classmate who's gotten a potions formula wrong." "Power doesn't make someone infallible," Luna replied matter-of-factly. "And sometimes the most powerful people are the ones most in need of someone willing to challenge their assumptions." The walk to Dumbledore's office felt longer than usual, each step bringing them closer to a revelation that could either save Harry's life or seal his fate. Luna could sense Harry's growing anxiety through their established connection, and she noticed that the Fragment around his scar was becoming more active as his stress levels increased. "Deep breaths," she murmured as they climbed the spiral staircase. "Remember the meditation techniques. Don't let the Fragment feed on your nervousness." Harry nodded, visibly forcing himself to relax as they reached the heavy oak door. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. "Luna," he said quietly, "if this goes badly, if Dumbledore decides that I need to be isolated or controlled somehow, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best of my life. For the first time since I learned what I was carrying, I felt like myself again. Luna turned to face him fully, removing her spectre specs so he could see her eyes clearly. "Harry Potter," she said, with quiet intensity, "this is not going to be the end of anything. This is going to be the beginning of finding a real solution." Before Harry could respond, the door swung open to reveal Professor Dumbledore himself, looking unsurprised by their presence, despite the fact that they hadn't yet knocked. "Miss Lovegood, Mr. Potter," he said, with his characteristic calm warmth. "Please come in. I believe we have much to discuss." Dumbledore's office looked exactly as it always did, cluttered with strange magical instruments, lined with portraits of former headmasters, and dominated by the magnificent phoenix perch where Fawkes sat preening his brilliant feathers. But tonight, the usual sense of whimsical chaos felt heavier, more purposeful, as though the room itself understood the gravity of their meeting. "Please, sit," Dumbledore said, gesturing to the chairs facing his desk. Luna noticed that he'd already prepared tea service for 3, further confirmation that their visit wasn't unexpected. Luna settled into her chair and immediately put her spectre specs back on, wanting to observe Dumbledore's emotional responses throughout their conversation. What she saw made her stomach tighten with unease. The headmaster's aura was a complex tapestry of guilt, determination, and what looked remarkably like grief. He was already mourning Harry, she realized. Whatever Dumbledore knew or suspected about Harry's condition, he'd already resigned himself to losing the boy. "Professor," Harry began, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to tell you something about my scar, about what Luna can see when she looks at me." Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but Luna watched his aura shift subtly toward resignation, mixed with relief. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe you do." Luna leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Professor, are you familiar with enhanced magical perception? The ability to see magical emanations and entities that are typically invisible to standard sight?" "I am," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes focusing on Luna with newfound interest. "It's an extremely rare gift, often associated with those who have experienced significant trauma or loss. I take it you possess such abilities, Miss Lovegood." "Since my mother died when I was 9, Luna confirmed. "Through specialized spectacles and natural sensitivity, I can observe emotional auras, magical creatures that others cannot see, and other phenomena." "Other phenomena," Dumbledore repeated, and Luna could see understanding dawning in his expression. "Such as soul magic, perhaps?" Luna felt Harry tense beside her, but she pressed forward with their prepared explanation. "Professor, when I look at Harry through my enhanced sight, I see something that should not be there. A dark fragment coiled around his scar that pulses with its own malevolent intelligence." "A fragment," Dumbledore said, his voice heavy with something that might have been sorrow or confirmation. "Yes, I have long suspected as much." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Luna felt Harry's shock as though it were her own, and she watched the fragment around his scar respond to his emotional turmoil with increased agitation. "You knew?" Harry demanded, his voice rising. "You knew I was carrying a piece of Voldemort, and you never told me." "I suspected," Dumbledore corrected gently, "but suspicion and certainty are vastly different things, especially when the implications of such certainty are so grave. Miss Lovegood's confirmation finally provides the proof that my worst fears were justified." Luna could see the careful calculation in Dumbledore's emotional emanations, the way he was parsing his words to reveal only what was necessary while maintaining control of the conversation. It made her profoundly uneasy. "What exactly did you suspect?" she asked, her tone sharper than she'd intended. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him, as he seemed to weigh how much to reveal. "The night Voldemort attempted to kill Harry," he said finally, "something unprecedented occurred. The killing curse rebounded, destroying Voldemort's physical form and leaving Harry with nothing more than a scar. But the magical residue around the scene suggested that something had torn during the encounter, something related to Voldemort's soul. Luna watched Harry's aura cycle through shock, anger, and betrayal as he processed this information. "You've known for 15 years that I might be carrying part of Voldemort," Harry said, his voice deadly quiet. "And you never thought to mention this to me." "What would you have had me do?" Dumbledore asked, his own voice carrying a note of weary pain. "Tell a child that he carried within him a fragment of the darkest wizard who ever lived. Explain that his very existence was tied to the survival of our greatest enemy." "Yes!" Harry exploded, standing abruptly from his chair. "Yes, you should have told me. Do you have any idea what it's been like, thinking I was going mad? Hearing voices, seeing visions, feeling angry and violent for no reason I could understand?" Through her spectre specs, Luna could see the fragment around Harry's scar feeding on his anger, growing larger and more defined with each word. But more concerning was Dumbledore's reaction. His aura had shifted to something approaching relief, as though Harry's emotional outburst confirmed some theory he'd been testing. "Harry," Luna said quietly, reaching for his hand. "Sit down. Remember what we discussed about not feeding the fragment." Harry looked down at her, and she could see him struggling to regain control. The moment her fingers touched his, the fragment's agitation diminished noticeably. "Fascinating," Dumbledore murmured, his keen eyes noting the interaction. "Physical contact disrupts the fragment's influence. That is unexpected." Luna's unease deepened as she realized that Dumbledore was treating this conversation like an experiment, gathering data about Harry's condition rather than showing appropriate concern for his well-being. "Professor," she said carefully, "what exactly are the implications of Harry carrying this fragment? What does it mean for his future?" Dumbledore's aura shifted to deep, penetrating sadness as he considered how to answer. Luna felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the emotional signature of someone preparing to deliver devastating news. "A Horcrux," Dumbledore said slowly, "is a piece of soul housed within an object, created through the most heinous act imaginable: murder. As long as the Horcrux exists, the original soul cannot pass on to whatever lies beyond death. Voldemort has created several such objects to ensure his immortality." "Several," Harry repeated, sinking back into his chair. "6, by my count," Dumbledore confirmed. "A diary that was destroyed in your second year, a ring that I located and destroyed last year, and 4 others that we must find and eliminate before Voldemort can be truly defeated." Luna felt a chill of understanding creeping up her spine. "And Harry?" "Harry is, I believe, the 7th Horcrux," Dumbledore said with gentle finality. "Created accidentally when Voldemort's murder of Lily Potter tore his already damaged soul. The fragment that attached itself to Harry is the reason the killing curse failed, and it is why Harry and Voldemort share their unique connection." "No," Luna said immediately, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "No, that's not possible. A Horcrux is an object, not a person. Harry is not a thing to be destroyed." "Miss Lovegood," Dumbledore said gently, "I understand your distress, but the nature of Harry's condition..." "The nature of Harry's condition is that he's carrying a foreign soul fragment. Not that he is a soul fragment," Luna interrupted, her composure finally cracking. "There has to be a difference. There has to be a way to remove the fragment without destroying Harry." Dumbledore's expression was infinitely compassionate and utterly immovable. "My dear girl, I have spent years researching precisely that question, consulted every expert on soul magic, examined every text on Horcrux theory, explored every possible alternative. The conclusion is inescapable. The only way to destroy Voldemort's soul fragment is to destroy its container." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Luna felt Harry's hand go slack in hers, watched his aura shift to numb resignation as he absorbed the implications of Dumbledore's statement. "So I have to die," Harry said quietly. "For Voldemort to be truly defeated, I have to die." "You have to be prepared to sacrifice yourself," Dumbledore corrected. "When the time comes, you must allow Voldemort to kill you. Only then can his final Horcrux be destroyed, and only then can he be truly mortal again." Luna stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "No," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "Absolutely not. I refuse to accept that premise." Both Harry and Dumbledore stared at her in surprise, clearly taken aback by her vehement reaction. "Miss Lovegood," Dumbledore said carefully, "I understand that this news is difficult to accept, but sometimes we must face hard truths." "Hard truths?" Luna's voice rose to a pitch that made Fawkes flutter his wings nervously. "You're talking about murdering a 17-year-old boy for the convenience of defeating a dark wizard. That's not a hard truth. That's a moral abdication." "Luna," Harry said quietly, "if it's the only way—" "It's not the only way," Luna snapped, whirling to face him. "It's the only way Dumbledore has been able to imagine, which is an entirely different thing." She turned back to the headmaster, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Professor, with all due respect, your research has been constrained by the assumption that Harry is fundamentally equivalent to an inanimate Horcrux. But he's not. He's a living being with his own soul, his own identity, his own magical signature that exists independently of the fragment." "Miss Lovegood," Dumbledore began, but Luna wasn't finished. "You've spent years treating this as a problem of magical theory," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But it's not just theory. It's about a specific person with specific circumstances that may not follow the general rules. Have you considered that the fragment's accidental creation might have left it more vulnerable than intentionally created Horcruxes? Have you researched whether the fact that Harry was an infant when the attachment occurred might affect the magical bonds involved?" Dumbledore's aura had shifted to something approaching uncertainty, and Luna pressed her advantage. "Have you investigated whether the protective magic from his mother's sacrifice might have influenced how the fragment integrated with Harry's soul? Have you considered that the fragment's location in scar tissue, rather than healthy magical channels, might create opportunities for separation that don't exist with traditional Horcruxes?" "I have considered some of these factors," Dumbledore admitted, but Luna could see in his emotional emanations that her questions had identified gaps in his research. "Some of them," Luna repeated. "Professor, you've been so focused on the precedent of previous Horcruxes that you haven't fully explored whether Harry's situation might be unprecedented in ways that could offer solutions." Harry was staring at Luna with something approaching awe, clearly amazed by her willingness to challenge one of the most powerful wizards alive. "Luna's right," he said quietly. "I'm not a cup or a locket or a diary. I'm a person who happens to be carrying something that doesn't belong to me. That has to make a difference somehow." Dumbledore was quiet for several minutes, his blue eyes moving between Harry and Luna as though seeing them both clearly for the first time. "You are proposing," he said finally, "that we approach this problem from an entirely new angle. That we treat Harry not as a Horcrux to be destroyed, but as a victim of soul magic to be healed." "Exactly," Luna said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were discussing. "We've already proven that the fragment can be weakened through meditation and emotional regulation. We've demonstrated that physical contact can disrupt its influence. We've shown that it responds differently to positive and negative emotions." "Which suggests," Harry added, his voice gaining confidence, "that it might be possible to starve the fragment of power until it can be safely removed." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The research you're proposing would be extraordinarily complex and dangerous. We would be venturing into uncharted territory of soul magic, with Harry's life as the stakes of our experimentation. As opposed to the current plan of definitely killing him, Luna asked pointedly. Miss Lovegood has a point, Albus, came a dry voice from one of the portraits. Phineas Nigellus Black was leaning forward in his frame with obvious interest. The boy's death was only ever acceptable if it was truly the only option. If there's even a possibility of an alternative, the risks of failed experimentation with soul magic are considerable, Dumbledore warned. We could end up strengthening the fragment instead of weakening it. We could damage Harry's own soul in the attempt to separate it from Voldemort's. We could make the situation significantly worse. Professor, Harry said quietly, it's my soul. It's my life. Don't I get to decide whether those risks are worth taking? Dumbledore studied Harry for a long moment, and Luna could see the battle playing out in his emotional aura between protective instincts and respect for Harry's autonomy. There would need to be strict protocols, he said finally. Comprehensive safety measures, multiple contingency plans in case the research takes a dangerous turn. Luna felt her heart leap with hope. You'll consider it. You'll actually research alternatives to sacrifice. I will research alternatives to sacrifice, Dumbledore confirmed. But Miss Lovegood, Mr. Potter, you must understand that this approach may ultimately prove impossible. We may invest months or years in research only to conclude that the original assessment was correct. But we might not, Harry said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine hope Luna had heard from him in weeks. We might find something that works. We might, Dumbledore agreed. Though I must insist on absolute secrecy regarding these discussions. If Voldemort learns that we know about the Horcruxes, or if he discovers that we're attempting to remove the fragment from Harry, he would undoubtedly take steps to protect his remaining anchors to life. Of course, Luna said immediately. We understand the need for discretion. Do you? Dumbledore asked, his blue eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement or warning. Because, Miss Lovegood, your passionate defense of Mr. Potter's life suggests that you have developed rather strong feelings about his welfare. Strong feelings can lead to impulsive decisions, which in this case could prove catastrophic. Luna felt her cheeks warm, but she met Dumbledore's gaze steadily. My feelings don't change the validity of my arguments, Professor. Harry deserves a chance at life, regardless of whether I care about him personally. Indeed, Dumbledore said softly, though I suspect your personal investment will prove to be both a strength and a vulnerability as we proceed. He stood from his desk, moving to one of the many cabinets that lined his office walls. I will need detailed documentation of your observations, Miss Lovegood. Everything you've noted about the fragment's behavior, its responses to different stimuli, the techniques that have proven effective in managing its influence. I have comprehensive notes, Luna said, pulling her journal from her bag. Observations, hypotheses, experimental results, theoretical frameworks, everything we've discovered over the past month. Dumbledore accepted the journal with reverent care, as though he understood that it contained the first real hope they'd had of saving Harry's life without requiring his death. This will take considerable time to analyze properly, he said. I will also need to consult with several experts in soul magic, though I must be extremely careful about how much information I reveal. How long? Harry asked. Weeks, perhaps months, Dumbledore admitted. Magical research of this complexity cannot be rushed without risking catastrophic errors. Luna could see Harry's disappointment, but she also noted that the fragment around his scar had grown noticeably dimmer during their conversation. Hope, it seemed, was as effective as meditation in weakening the fragment's hold. In the meantime, Dumbledore continued, you must continue your current practices. The meditation techniques, the emotional regulation, the careful monitoring of the fragment's activity, all of this will be valuable data for our research. And we can still meet together? Luna asked. Harry's connection to other people seems to be one of our most effective tools for managing the fragment. Dumbledore's eyes moved between them with obvious understanding of what he was observing. Yes, though I would recommend that you expand your support network gradually. Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger, perhaps, when you feel ready to share this burden with them. Ron and Hermione, Harry said thoughtfully. They've already noticed that something's different about me. Close friends often provide the strongest barriers against dark influence, Dumbledore observed. Though Miss Lovegood's unique perceptions make her particularly valuable to this endeavor. As they prepared to leave Dumbledore's office, Luna felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about what they'd set in motion. They'd gained a powerful ally in their fight to save Harry's life, but they'd also committed themselves to a course of action that could take months or years to resolve. "Professor," Harry said as they reached the door, "thank you for listening to us, for taking our arguments seriously." "Thank you, Mr. Potter, for being willing to fight for your own life," Dumbledore replied. "And Miss Lovegood, thank you for refusing to accept the unacceptable. Your fierce loyalty may well prove to be the key to solving this puzzle." As they descended the spiral staircase, Luna could feel the weight of what lay ahead, pressing down on them both. They'd won an important victory tonight, but it was only the beginning of a much larger battle. "How do you feel?" she asked Harry as they walked through the quiet corridors. "Hopeful," Harry said, surprise evident in his voice. "For the first time since you told me what I was carrying, I actually feel hopeful about the future." "Good," Luna said, adjusting her spectre specs to observe the fragment around his scar. Because hope starves the fragment better than almost anything else. That night, Luna sat in her dormitory, writing a new entry in her research journal. But this time, her notes were interspersed with genuine optimism for the first time since she'd begun documenting Harry's condition. Breakthrough. Dumbledore has agreed to research alternatives to sacrificial destruction of the host, she wrote. While his initial assumptions were constrained by traditional Horcrux theory, he demonstrated willingness to consider unprecedented approaches when presented with logical arguments. She paused, thinking about Harry's expression when Dumbledore had agreed to explore other options. Hypothesis. The subject's psychological state may be as important as his magical condition in determining outcomes. Hope and connection to others appear to weaken the fragment significantly, while despair and isolation strengthen it. This suggests that emotional healing may be as crucial as magical intervention in achieving successful separation. Luna closed her journal and prepared for bed. But sleep was slow to come. Tomorrow would begin the next phase of their journey, a phase that required not just courage and determination, but patience and faith that solutions existed even when they couldn't yet see them. But for the first time since she'd seen that writhing darkness around Harry's scar, Luna Lovegood allowed herself to believe that they might actually save him, and that belief, she was certain, would prove to be more powerful than any dark magic Voldemort had ever created. Chapter 7. The Cost of Connection. The first vision came to Harry during a quiet moment in the library, while he and Luna were researching protective ward structures for their upcoming attempt at advanced shielding magic. One moment he was reading about runic inscription techniques, and the next he was seeing Luna through a lens of pure malevolence, watching his own hands close around her throat while her eyes widened in shock and betrayal. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Harry shaking and sick, his hands clenched so tightly around his quill that he thought it might snap. "Harry!" Luna's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was sitting directly across from him. "What's wrong? You've gone completely pale." Harry looked up at her, really looked at her, and felt his stomach lurch as he realized that the vision hadn't felt foreign the way his usual connections to Voldemort did. It had felt like his own desire, his own hands, his own satisfaction at the thought of silencing her forever. "Nothing," he lied, forcing his grip to relax. "Just tired. We've been at this for hours." But Luna's enhanced sight showed her things that Harry couldn't hide. Through her spectre specs, she could see the fragment around his scar, writhing with unprecedented agitation, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed almost eager. More concerning was the way Harry's own emotional aura had taken on traces of that darkness, threads of malevolence weaving through his natural patterns like poison in clear water. "The fragment is very active today," she observed carefully, her voice neutral despite her growing concern. "More active than I've seen it since it first began speaking to you." Harry's jaw tightened, and Luna watched the fragment pulse in response to his emotional tension. "It's fine. I can handle it." "Harry," Luna said gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "What did you see? The vision you just had. What was it about?" The moment her skin made contact with his, Harry jerked back as though she'd burned him. The fragment around his scar had recoiled from her touch with such violence that Harry felt a sharp spike of pain lance through his skull. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice harsher than he'd intended. "Just don't touch me right now." Luna's hand hovered in the air between them for a moment before she slowly lowered it to the table. Through her spectre specs, she could see that Harry's emotional aura was fluctuating wildly, his natural warmth and affection for her battling against something cold and predatory that definitely didn't belong to him. "The fragment doesn't want me to touch you," she said, making the observation with clinical detachment, despite the hurt that was beginning to bloom in her chest. "It's trying to make you afraid of physical contact with me." "Maybe it has a point," Harry muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Maybe you shouldn't be touching me. Maybe you shouldn't be anywhere near me." "Harry Potter," Luna said, her voice carrying a warning note that made him look up in surprise. "Look at me and tell me that you genuinely believe I'd be safer away from you than I am helping you manage this condition." Harry met her eyes for just a moment before looking away again, and Luna could see the answer written clearly in his expression. He didn't believe it, but the fragment was working very hard to convince him otherwise. "It's getting stronger," he admitted quietly. "The fragment. Ever since we talked to Dumbledore, ever since I started hoping that there might be another way, it's been fighting back harder." Luna nodded, having suspected as much based on her observations over the past week. "It perceives hope as a threat. Our research, our connection, the possibility that you might survive this, all of that weakens its hold on you, so it's becoming more aggressive in its attempts to reassert control. And the easiest way to regain control is to isolate me from the people who might help," Harry said, finally understanding the pattern. "Starting with you, since you're the one who can actually see what it's doing." "Exactly," Luna said, adjusting her spectre specs to observe the fragment more closely. "Which is why we can't let it succeed. The moment you start avoiding me to protect me, you'll be giving it exactly what it wants." But even as she said the words, Luna could see that the fragment was already succeeding in its campaign to drive them apart. Harry's posture had shifted subtly away from her, creating physical distance even while they sat at the same table. His emotional aura showed constant vigilance, as though he were monitoring himself for signs of threat to her safety. The fragment, meanwhile, pulsed with what looked remarkably like satisfaction. Over the next several days, the visions became more frequent and more disturbing. Harry would be walking with Luna between classes and suddenly see himself pushing her down a flight of stairs. He would be sharing a meal with her and imagine himself hexing her food with something painful and dangerous. During their study sessions in the Room of Requirement, the fragment would show him elaborate fantasies of using the very protective magic they were researching to hurt her instead. Each vision felt more real than the last, more like genuine desire than foreign intrusion. The fragment was getting better at mimicking Harry's own thought patterns, making it increasingly difficult for him to distinguish between his actual feelings and the dark impulses it was feeding him. Harry began to withdraw, subtly at first and then more obviously. He stopped sitting next to Luna during meals, claiming he needed space to think. He arrived late to their scheduled meetings and left early, citing homework or Quidditch practice. When Luna tried to touch him, even casually, like a hand on his shoulder or their fingers brushing as they passed books, he would find excuses to move away. Luna watched this progression with growing alarm and frustration. Through her spectre specs, she could see that Harry's withdrawal was having exactly the effect the fragment intended. Without their regular physical contact and emotional connection, the dark thing around his scar was growing larger and more defined, feeding on his isolation and self-doubt. "Your pet seems to be misbehaving more than usual," she observed during one of their increasingly rare conversations, using their coded language despite the fact that they were alone in the room of requirement. Harry was sitting on the opposite side of the room from her, as far from Luna as he could get, while still maintaining the pretense that they were having a normal study session. "Maybe it's time to consider that some pets are too dangerous to keep," Harry replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Maybe the responsible thing is to put some distance between the pet and anyone it might hurt. And maybe," Luna said with equal calm, "the pet is most dangerous precisely when it's isolated and untrained. Maybe the solution is more training, not less." Harry's hands clenched in his lap, and Luna could see the fragment around his scar pulse with anticipation. It wanted this argument, she realized. It wanted Harry to push her away, to become angry and defensive about his decision to withdraw. "Luna," Harry said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that broke her heart. "You don't understand what the visions are like. You don't see what the fragment makes me want to do to you. I can't risk—" "What I see," Luna interrupted, standing from her chair and walking toward him, despite the way he tensed at her approach, "is a fragment that's terrified of losing its hold on you. And what I see happening right now is you giving it exactly what it wants." Harry stood abruptly when Luna got within arm's reach, backing away until he hit the wall behind him. "Stay back," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Please, Luna. Just stay away from me." "No," Luna said simply, continuing to approach him. "I won't stay away from you. I won't let the fragment trick you into thinking that isolation will protect me." "It's not a trick," Harry exploded, his control finally snapping. "The visions are real, Luna. I see myself hurting you in dozens of different ways, and each time it feels more like something I actually want to do. What if next time it's not just a vision? What if next time I actually—" Harry's words cut off abruptly as the fragment seized the moment of emotional volatility to make its move. His expression went blank for a split second, and then his hand shot out with inhuman speed, grabbing Luna's wrist with enough force to bruise. But instead of pulling away or trying to escape, Luna did something that shocked both Harry and the fragment. She stepped closer, placing her free hand gently against Harry's forehead, directly over his scar. The reaction was immediate and violent. Harry screamed, a sound of pure agony that had nothing to do with his own pain and everything to do with the fragment's response to Luna's touch. His grip on her wrist released instantly as he collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Luna knelt beside him, keeping her hand pressed firmly against his scar despite the way her fingers tingled with an uncomfortable energy that felt like touching something fundamentally wrong. "Harry," she said quietly, her voice cutting through his anguish. "Listen to my voice. Focus on my voice, not on the fragment. You are Harry Potter. You care about me. You would never hurt me willingly. That's not the fragment talking. That's you." Gradually, Harry's screaming subsided to ragged breathing. When he finally looked up at Luna, his eyes were his own again, filled with horror and self-recrimination. "I could have hurt you," he whispered. "I was going to hurt you. If you hadn't—" "But I did," Luna said firmly, finally removing her hand from his scar. "And the important thing is that the moment I made contact, the fragment lost control. It can influence you, Harry, but it can't overpower you completely when I'm here." Harry stared at her, processing the implications of what had just happened. "Your touch disrupts its control. But Luna, what if next time you're not close enough? What if next time it makes me grab something sharp or push you into danger before you can react?" Luna was quiet for a moment, and Harry could see her working through the same fears that had been plaguing him. "Then we'll have to make sure there is no next time," she said finally. "We'll have to find a way to strengthen our connection so that the fragment can't isolate you from me even when we're not physically together." "How?" Harry asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Luna helped him to his feet, noting how he still tried to maintain distance between them, despite what they'd just discovered about the protective nature of her touch. "Magic," she said simply. "There are bonding rituals, connection charms, ways of linking two people's magical signatures so that they can support each other across distance. I've been reading about them in some of the more advanced texts Dumbledore recommended." Harry's expression grew troubled. "Bonding rituals? Luna, that sounds permanent. What if something goes wrong? What if the fragment finds a way to use our connection against you?" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Luna said with characteristic practicality. "But, Harry, we've just proven that our connection weakens the fragment's control. The stronger our bond becomes, the less power it will have over you." She moved to the bookshelf the room had provided, selecting a thick volume, bound in deep blue leather. This text describes several types of magical bonding between wizards. Some are romantic in nature, others are purely platonic. Some are temporary, others are permanent. We can choose the type that best serves our needs. Harry accepted the book from her, careful not to let their fingers touch, despite everything they'd just learned about the protective power of contact. Old habits of fear died hard, apparently. "Luna," he said quietly, as he flipped through pages describing complex magical theory and intricate ritual requirements. "Are you sure about this? Binding yourself to someone who's carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul? It could have consequences we can't predict." Luna removed her spectre specs and looked at Harry with clear, direct eyes. "Harry Potter," she said with quiet intensity, "you are not someone who's carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul. You are someone who's fighting a piece of Voldemort's soul and winning. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harry asked, his voice carrying all the doubt and self-recrimination he'd been battling for weeks. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like the fragment is getting stronger, not weaker. It feels like I'm losing ground every day." "The fragment is getting more desperate," Luna corrected. "There's a difference between strength and desperation. Harry, a cornered animal fights hardest just before it's captured." She reached for his hand, slowly and deliberately, giving him every opportunity to pull away. When he didn't, she interlaced their fingers and watched through her spectre specs as the fragment around his scar writhed in what looked unmistakably like distress. "Feel that," she said softly. "Feel how the fragment reacts to our contact. It's not getting stronger, it's getting more afraid. And the more afraid it becomes, the more aggressive its attempts to separate us." Harry did feel it. The way the dark presence in his mind seemed to shrink back from Luna's touch. The way his thoughts became clearer and more distinctly his own when she was close. "But the visions," he protested. "They're getting worse, more violent." "Because the fragment is running out of options," Luna said. "It's tried subtle manipulation, direct communication, and physical compulsion. Now it's resorting to psychological warfare, trying to make you so afraid of hurting me that you'll choose isolation over connection." Luna adjusted her spectre specs with her free hand, studying the fragment's behavior as she spoke. "But Harry, look what happens when we maintain contact, despite the threats. The fragment doesn't actually become more powerful. It becomes more frantic." Harry followed her gaze to the magical mirror the room had provided, and through Luna's spectre specs he could see his own reflection overlaid with the writhing darkness around his scar. But as he watched, he began to notice that Luna was right. The fragment wasn't growing larger or more defined. If anything, it seemed to be pulling back from the areas where Luna's magical signature overlapped with his own. "It's afraid of you," he realized with growing amazement. The fragment is actually afraid of you. Not of me specifically, Luna clarified. It's afraid of what I represent. Connection, hope, the possibility that you might choose love over isolation. Those are the things that weaken its hold on you. Harry stared at their joined hands, watching the play of magical energies that Luna's enhanced sight revealed. Where their skin touched, his natural magical aura seemed brighter, more vibrant, while the fragment's dark presence grew dimmer and more constrained. The bonding ritual, he said quietly. If it works, if it strengthens our connection, the fragment might not be able to show me those visions anymore. That's the theory, Luna agreed, and even if it can still influence your thoughts, a strong enough bond would allow me to anchor you to yourself when the fragment tries to take control. Harry was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what Luna was proposing. A magical bond would tie them together in ways that went far beyond friendship, creating a connection that would persist even if they were separated by distance or circumstance. What if you change your mind later? He asked finally. What if you decide that being bonded to someone with my condition isn't what you want for your life? Luna smiled, the expression soft and sure in a way that made Harry's chest tighten with emotions he didn't quite know how to name. Harry, she said gently, I chose to help you long before I understood the full scope of what that choice would mean. I chose to stay even when the fragment tried to make you hurt me. I chose to touch your scar when you were losing control, even though I had no idea what effect it might have on me. She squeezed his hand, watching through her spectre specs as the fragment continued to recoil from their contact. I've been choosing you over and over again, in small ways and large ones for weeks now, she continued. A bonding ritual wouldn't change that. It would just make it official. Harry felt tears prick at his eyes as the full weight of Luna's unwavering loyalty settled over him. She'd seen him at his worst, witnessed the darkest parts of what he carried, and still she chose to stand beside him. Luna, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I don't deserve has nothing to do with it, Luna interrupted firmly. Love isn't about deserving, Harry. It's about choosing. And I choose you, fragment and all. The word love hung in the air between them, powerful and transformative, in a way that made the fragment around Harry's scar contract as though it had been struck. Through her spectre specs, Luna watched the dark thing writhe in what appeared to be genuine distress, and she realized that their emotional honesty was as effective as any protective magic they might attempt. I choose you too, Harry said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. I choose you, and I choose to fight for a future where we both survive this. As if summoned by their mutual declaration, the room of requirement began to change around them. The simple study space transformed into something warmer and more intimate. Soft chairs arranged near a crackling fireplace, shelves lined with books on advanced magical theory, and a small table set with the components they would need for bonding magic. The room knows what we need, Luna observed with satisfaction. It's providing everything necessary for the ritual. Harry looked around the transformed space, noting the careful arrangement of crystals, candles, and other magical implements that would facilitate the bonding process. Are you sure about this? He asked one final time. Once we do this, there's no going back. We'll be connected for life, Luna. My problems will become your problems. Your problems are already my problems, Luna pointed out practically. The only difference is that after the ritual, I'll be better equipped to help you solve them. She stood from her chair, moving to examine the materials the room had provided. Besides, Harry, I think you're underestimating what you bring to this partnership. You're not just someone who needs help. You're someone who's spent years fighting dark magic with nothing but courage and determination. That strength will flow both ways through our bond. Harry joined her at the ritual table, studying the complex array of magical components. How does it work? The bonding ritual? We'll need to cast it together, Luna explained, opening one of the texts to a page describing the specific incantations and movements required. The magic creates a connection between our core magical signatures, allowing us to share emotional and magical energy across any distance. She traced the runic diagrams illustrated on the page, her finger following the intricate patterns that would channel their combined power. Once the bond is established, you'll be able to draw on my emotional stability when the fragment tries to overwhelm you, and I'll be able to sense when you're in distress and need support, even if we're not physically together. And the fragment? Harry asked. Will the bond affect it directly? Luna adjusted her spectre specs, studying the dark presence around his scar with newfound understanding. I think the bond will make it much harder for the fragment to isolate you. Right now, it can manipulate your emotions and thoughts when you're alone, convince you that you're dangerous and should push people away. But with a strong magical connection to someone who knows your true nature, those manipulations will be much less effective. Harry nodded, feeling a sense of rightness about their decision that he hadn't experienced since learning what he carried. This felt like more than just a survival strategy. It felt like a choice to build something positive and lasting, despite the darkness they were fighting. When? He asked. Now, Luna said simply. The fragment is already fighting harder against our connection. The longer we wait, the more time it has to find ways to disrupt the ritual. She began arranging the ritual components according to the instructions in the text, her movements precise and confident, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Luna, Harry said as she worked, whatever happens after this, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best of my life. You gave me hope when I thought there wasn't any. You made me feel human again. Luna looked up from her preparations, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And you gave me a purpose, Harry. For years I've been seeing things that others couldn't see, knowing truths that others couldn't understand. But I've never been able to use that sight to truly help someone until now. She finished arranging the crystals in the required pattern and lit the candles with a whispered charm. Are you ready? Harry took a deep breath, feeling the fragment around his scar pulse with agitation as it sensed what they were about to do. But beneath the fragment's distress, Harry could feel his own excitement and anticipation. For the first time since learning what he carried, he was taking positive action rather than simply defending against attack. I'm ready, he said, reaching for Luna's hand. Together, they began the incantation that would bind their magical signatures together, creating a connection that would endure for the rest of their lives. As their voices joined in the ancient words of bonding, the fragment around Harry's scar writhed in what looked unmistakably like terror, and Harry knew that they had finally found a weapon that could truly threaten the piece of Voldemort he carried. The bonding light grew brighter around them, washing away the shadows that had plagued Harry for so long, and for the first time since he was 15 months old, Harry Potter felt completely and utterly safe. Chapter 8. Hermione's Discovery. Hermione Granger had always prided herself on being observant, but it had taken her nearly 3 weeks to piece together the pattern of Harry's mysterious disappearances. At first, she'd attributed his changed behavior to the stress of their 5th year, Umbridge's increasingly tyrannical rule, the pressures of preparing for OWLS, and the general atmosphere of fear that pervaded Hogwarts since Voldemort's return. But Harry's changes went deeper than stress could explain. He was calmer than she'd ever seen him, less prone to the explosive anger that had characterized much of their 5th year, and there was a new quality to his attention when he interacted with others, as though he were consciously choosing kindness over irritation in ways that seemed almost therapeutic rather than natural. More puzzling was his friendship with Luna Lovegood. Harry had always been polite to Luna, even when Ron made disparaging comments about her eccentricity, but the sudden depth of their connection was unprecedented. They spoke in cryptic half-sentences about training sessions and pet care, shared meaningful glances across the great hall, and had developed what appeared to be an elaborate system of subtle gestures that Hermione couldn't decode. Most concerning of all was the way they touched each other, casual contact that seemed far more significant than typical teenage friendship would warrant. Luna would place her hand on Harry's shoulder during conversations, and Harry would relax in ways that suggested profound relief rather than simple comfort. When Luna adjusted Harry's collar or brushed imaginary dust from his robes, Harry's entire posture would shift as though some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Hermione had initially dismissed these observations as evidence of a developing romantic relationship, but the interactions didn't feel romantic so much as medicinal. Luna touched Harry the way a healer might touch a patient, with purposeful intention rather than casual affection. The final piece of the puzzle came when Hermione noticed that Harry's headaches had virtually disappeared. For years, Harry had suffered from periodic episodes where he would press his hand to his scar and wince in obvious pain. But over the past month, those episodes had become increasingly rare, and when they did occur, they seemed to resolve quickly if Luna was nearby. Hermione decided to investigate. She began by following Harry at a discreet distance, noting the patterns of his movements between classes. Most of his mysterious absences occurred in the evenings, when he would claim to be going to the library or to work on homework alone. But Hermione's careful observation revealed that Harry never actually arrived at the library during these supposed study sessions. Instead, he made his way to the 7th floor, where he would pace back and forth in front of a blank stretch of wall that Hermione eventually realized must be the entrance to the Room of Requirement. On Thursday evening, Hermione waited until Harry had been inside for nearly 20 minutes before approaching the wall herself. She focused her thoughts on needing to understand what was happening to her best friend, and was unsurprised when a door appeared, though she was careful to make it several feet away from what she assumed was Harry's entrance. The room Hermione stepped into was clearly designed for academic research, but the subject matter made her blood run cold. Tables covered with books on soul magic, dark arts theory, and protective ward structures dominated the space. Charts showing runic inscription patterns hung from the walls, and several magical instruments that Hermione didn't recognize hummed quietly with their own inner energy. But what captured her attention immediately was the sound of voices from an adjacent room. Harry and Luna engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion about magical theory. The binding ritual definitely helped, Harry was saying, his voice carrying a relief that Hermione had never heard before. The fragment hasn't been able to show me those visions since we completed it. I can feel it there, but it's distant, like it's behind a wall instead of sharing space in my head. That's exactly what we hoped would happen, Luna replied, and Hermione could hear the satisfaction in her voice. The bond creates a buffer between your core consciousness and the fragment's influence. It's much harder for it to manipulate your thoughts when you have a direct connection to someone who knows your true nature. Fragment, Hermione thought with growing alarm. They were talking about some kind of magical entity or influence that was apparently located in Harry's head, and whatever it was, it had been showing Harry disturbing visions before they'd found a way to block them. Hermione moved closer to the connecting doorway, careful not to make noise that might alert them to her presence. "Luna," Harry's voice had taken on a note of concern. "What if the bond isn't permanent? What if the fragment finds a way to disrupt our connection?" "Then we'll strengthen it," Luna said with characteristic calm. "The bond is based on our emotional attachment to each other, Harry. As long as we continue to choose each other, continue to trust each other, the fragment won't be able to break what we've built." "And if something happens to you?" Harry asked quietly. "If the fragment finds a way to hurt you, despite all our precautions?" "It won't," Luna said with absolute conviction. "The fragment is weakening, Harry. I can see it through my spectre specs. It's smaller than it was a month ago, less active, less able to influence your emotional state. Our research is working." Hermione felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Whatever was happening to Harry involved some kind of dark magical entity that had been influencing his thoughts and emotions. Luna had been helping him fight it through methods that apparently required physical bonding and emotional connection. And they had been conducting this research in secret, without telling anyone else what was happening. Hermione stepped through the connecting doorway and found Harry and Luna seated at a table covered with open books and detailed notes. Luna was wearing her characteristic spectre specs, and she was studying Harry with the intense focus of someone making clinical observations. "Hello, Hermione," Luna said, without looking away from Harry, apparently unsurprised by her presence. "I was wondering when you'd figure out where we were meeting." Harry's head snapped up, his face cycling through surprise, panic, and resignation in the space of a few seconds. "Hermione, how long have you been listening?" "Long enough," Hermione said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the mix of hurt and concern churning in her chest. "Long enough to know that you've been hiding something significant from Ron and me. Something involving dark magic and Harry's scar." Luna finally turned to look at Hermione directly, and Hermione was struck by the absence of guilt or embarrassment in her expression. Luna looked like someone who had been caught doing exactly what she believed was right. "We didn't tell you because we weren't sure how to explain it," Luna said simply, "and because the information is dangerous. The fewer people who know, the safer everyone is." "Dangerous," Hermione repeated, moving further into the room so she could see the research materials more clearly. "What exactly are we talking about here? What's this fragment you mentioned?" Harry and Luna exchanged a long look, clearly communicating something through their established connection. Hermione watched this silent conversation with growing frustration. They'd developed an intimacy that excluded her completely, and she was only now realizing how far outside their confidence she'd fallen. "Hermione," Harry said finally, "what do you know about Horcruxes?" The word hit Hermione like a physical blow. She'd encountered references to Horcruxes in some of the darkest magical texts she'd ever read. Brief, horrifying mentions of objects containing fragments of wizards' souls, created through the most evil acts imaginable. "Horcruxes are created through murder," she said slowly, her brilliant mind immediately jumping to the most terrifying possible conclusion. "They're objects that contain pieces of a dark wizard's soul, designed to prevent death even if the body is destroyed." "Yes," Luna said gently, "and sometimes, in very rare cases, a soul fragment can attach itself to a living person instead of an inanimate object." Hermione sank into one of the chairs at their table, her legs suddenly too weak to support her as the full implications crashed over her. "Harry. Oh, Harry, no." "I'm carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul," Harry confirmed quietly. "It attached to me the night he killed my parents, when his curse rebounded. I've been hosting it for my entire life." "That's why your scar hurts when Voldemort is angry," Hermione said, her analytical mind racing through everything she knew about Harry's unusual experiences. "That's why you have those visions, why you can see through his eyes sometimes. You're connected to him because you're carrying part of him." "Exactly," Luna said, pulling one of her journals toward her and opening it to a page covered with detailed observations. "I can see the fragment through my enhanced sight. It appears as a dark presence coiled around Harry's scar, and it reacts to his emotional state." Hermione looked down at the journal, scanning Luna's careful notes about fragment behavior, emotional triggers, and the various techniques they'd attempted to manage its influence. The research was thorough, methodical, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "How long have you known?" she asked Harry. "Luna figured it out about a month ago," Harry said. "She told me what she could see, and we started researching together. We've been working on ways to weaken the fragment's influence without—" He trailed off, but Hermione's quick mind filled in the blank immediately. "Without destroying the container," she finished, her voice hollow. "Because to destroy a Horcrux, you have to destroy whatever's housing it. And if you're the container, then I die," Harry confirmed. "Yes, that's what Dumbledore initially told us," that the only way to truly defeat Voldemort would be for me to sacrifice myself so that his final soul fragment could be destroyed. Initially? Hermione seized on the word. You've spoken to Dumbledore about this? Luna convinced me to tell him, Harry said. She refused to accept that my death was the only solution, and she argued that there might be alternatives if we approach the problem differently. Hermione looked between them, noting the way they spoke about life and death decisions with the calm of people who had already processed the emotional weight of such discussions. They'd been living with this knowledge for weeks, supporting each other through the psychological burden of Harry's condition, while she and Ron had remained completely unaware. What alternatives? She asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Luna leaned forward, her expression earnest. We've been researching whether it might be possible to separate the fragment from Harry's soul without killing him. The bonding ritual we performed creates a connection between our magical signatures that seems to weaken the fragment's hold on Harry's consciousness. Bonding ritual, Hermione repeated, her eyes moving between them with new understanding. You've performed magical bonding with each other. That's serious magic, Luna. That's not something you undo easily. We don't want to undo it, Harry said simply. The bond helps me maintain control when the fragment tries to influence my thoughts or emotions. Luna can anchor me to myself when it attempts to take over. Hermione felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, mixed with genuine concern for her friend's welfare. They'd bound themselves together magically, while keeping her completely in the dark about the reasons. Have you considered the risks? She asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Magical bonding with someone who's carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul could have consequences you haven't anticipated. What if the fragment finds a way to use your connection against you? What if it learns to influence Luna through her bond with Harry? We've considered those possibilities, Luna said calmly. But the alternative, allowing Harry to face this alone, virtually guarantees that the fragment eventually succeeds in claiming him entirely. The bond may carry risks, but isolation carries certainties that are much worse. Hermione studied Luna's expression, noting the absolute conviction in her voice. Luna had approached this decision with the same dreamy certainty she applied to her belief in Nargles and Raxburts, but the research spread across their table suggested that her confidence was based on careful observation rather than whimsical faith. Show me everything, Hermione said finally. Your observations, your research, the theoretical framework you've developed. If you want my help, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Over the next 2 hours, Luna and Harry walked Hermione through their entire investigation. They explained Luna's enhanced sight and her ability to observe the fragment directly. They described the various techniques they'd developed for managing its influence, from meditation and emotional regulation to protective ward structures and the bonding ritual that had strengthened their connection. Hermione absorbed the information with characteristic thoroughness, asking pointed questions and requesting clarification when their explanations touched on magical theory she wasn't familiar with. But as the scope of their work became clear, so did the magnitude of the problem they were trying to solve. This is extraordinary research, she said finally, closing the journal she'd been reading. The scope of what you've discovered about soul magic and fragment behavior. It's genuinely groundbreaking work. Thank you, Luna said, though her tone suggested she was waiting for a qualification to follow. Hermione took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the logical assessment that she knew would devastate her friends. But, she continued, I have to tell you that from a purely theoretical standpoint, everything I've read supports Dumbledore's original conclusion. Horcruxes can only be destroyed through the complete annihilation of their containers. There's no known method for separating a soul fragment from a living host without killing them. No known method, Harry repeated, his voice carefully controlled. That doesn't mean no method exists. Harry, Hermione said gently, I understand why you want to believe there's another way. But the magical principles involved. Soul magic isn't like transfiguration or charms, where you can experiment with new techniques without catastrophic consequences. Getting it wrong doesn't just mean failure. It means destroying both your soul and Luna's. And getting it right means saving both our souls, Luna countered, her voice carrying a note of steel that Hermione had never heard from her before. Hermione, you're approaching this as though Harry were a typical Horcrux, but he's not. He's a living person who happens to be carrying a soul fragment that was attached accidentally when he was an infant. Which makes him a living Horcrux, Hermione said firmly. The circumstances of creation don't change the fundamental magical reality of what he's become. Don't they? Luna challenged. Have you found any historical examples of accidentally created living Horcruxes in your research? Any precedents for soul fragments attaching to infants, protected by sacrificial magic? Hermione paused, realizing that Luna had identified a significant gap in the existing literature. No, she admitted reluctantly. Harry's situation does appear to be unprecedented. Exactly, Luna said, leaning forward intently. We're not dealing with a standard Horcrux created through intentional dark magic. We're dealing with a unique magical accident that may not follow the usual rules. Harry watched this exchange with growing tension, clearly caught between his respect for Hermione's logical analysis and his faith in Luna's hopeful determination. What do you think I should do? He asked Hermione directly. Accept that I have to die to defeat Voldemort, or continue researching alternatives that may not exist. Hermione was quiet for several minutes, her analytical mind wrestling with the conflict between logical certainty and the slim possibility that unprecedented circumstances might yield unprecedented solutions. I think, she said finally, that you should continue the research, but with realistic expectations about the likely outcome. The probability that you'll find a way to remove the fragment safely is very small, but the stakes are high enough that even a small probability is worth investigating. It wasn't the wholehearted support that Luna had hoped for, but it wasn't the complete dismissal that Harry had feared. You'll help us? Luna asked. I'll help you, Hermione confirmed, but I'm also going to continue working on contingency plans in case the research fails. If there's truly no way to save Harry, we need to ensure that his sacrifice achieves its intended purpose. Contingency plans, Harry repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Plans for how to ensure that when the time comes, your death actually destroys the fragment permanently, Hermione said with characteristic bluntness. Plans for how to protect the people you care about when Voldemort realizes what you're attempting. Plans for how to continue the fight against him after you're gone. The room fell silent as the weight of Hermione's words settled over them. She was offering to help with their research, while simultaneously planning for Harry's death, a logical approach that acknowledged both hope and harsh reality. I don't want to plan for Harry's death, Luna said quietly, her calm demeanor finally showing cracks. I want to plan for his life. And I want to plan for both possibilities, Hermione replied gently. Luna, I admire your faith in finding alternatives. I genuinely hope you're right. But hope isn't a strategy, and we can't afford to be caught unprepared if your research doesn't yield the results you want. Luna's hands clenched in her lap, and through her spectre specs, she could see Harry's emotional aura cycling through frustration, gratitude, and a deep sadness that suggested he was beginning to accept Hermione's pragmatic approach. You're right, Harry said quietly, causing Luna to look at him in surprise. Hermione's right, Luna. We need to research alternatives, but we also need to prepare for the possibility that there aren't any. Harry, Luna began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I'm not giving up, he said firmly. I want to live, Luna. I want a future with you, and with Ron and Hermione, and with all the people I care about. But I can't ignore the logical reality that our research might not succeed. Luna stared at him for a moment, and Hermione could see the battle playing out in her expression between hope and the growing recognition that Harry's situation might truly be hopeless. All right, Luna said finally, her voice small but determined. "We plan for both possibilities. We research alternatives while preparing for sacrifice. But I'm not giving up on finding a way to save you, Harry. Not ever." "I wouldn't expect you to," Harry said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Your refusal to accept the unacceptable is what's kept me sane through all of this." Hermione watched their interaction with a mixture of admiration and concern. The depth of their connection was obvious, but she worried that Luna's emotional investment in saving Harry might cloud her judgment about what was truly possible. "We'll need to restructure our research approach," she said practically. "Divide our efforts between investigating fragment removal techniques and developing more effective methods for Harry to maintain control until the time comes for final confrontation." "The time comes," Luna repeated, her voice carrying a note of protest. "You're talking as though Harry's death is inevitable." "I'm talking as though Harry's death is probable," Hermione corrected. "There's a difference. Probable outcomes require preparation. But Luna, I promise you that I will help research every possible alternative with the same thoroughness I would apply to any academic question." Luna nodded reluctantly, accepting Hermione's offer, despite her frustration with the logical framework it implied. "What about Ron?" Harry asked. "Do we tell him?" Hermione considered this carefully. "Ron should know. He's your best friend, and he's proven that he can handle difficult truths when they're presented properly. But we should be prepared for him to react emotionally rather than analytically." "He'll want to fight," Luna observed. "Ron's instinct when people he cares about are threatened is to attack the source of the threat, not to conduct careful research about theoretical solutions." "Which might not be entirely bad," Harry said thoughtfully. "Someone needs to be thinking about how to defeat Voldemort directly, not just how to remove his Horcruxes. Ron's strategic thinking about the broader war might complement our focus on the soul magic research." They spent another hour working out the logistics of expanding their group to include both Hermione and Ron. Hermione insisted on developing more rigorous research protocols and better documentation methods. Luna agreed to teach Hermione how to observe the fragment's behavior using magical instruments, since Hermione couldn't see it directly. Harry suggested that they begin meeting more regularly and in larger groups, since their expanded research would require more time and diverse perspectives. As they prepared to leave the room of requirement, Hermione caught Harry's arm gently. "Harry," she said quietly, "I want you to know that even if we can't find a way to remove the fragment safely, your life has value beyond its utility in defeating Voldemort. You're not just a weapon or a sacrifice. You're our friend, and you deserve to fight for your own survival." Harry's eyes filled with tears at her words, and Hermione realized that he'd been carrying not just the fragment's darkness, but also the weight of believing that his death was his primary value to the people he loved. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for saying that, and for agreeing to help, even when you think the research probably won't work." "Hope may not be a strategy," Hermione said, squeezing his arm. "But it's still worth preserving. And Luna's right about one thing. Your situation is unprecedented enough that the usual rules may not apply." Luna smiled at Hermione's words, the first genuine warmth she'd shown since their discussion of contingency plans. "We're going to save him," she said with quiet conviction. "All three of us, working together. We're going to find a way." "We're going to try," Hermione agreed. "And sometimes, trying with everything you have is the same thing as succeeding." That night, Hermione lay in her dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling, while her roommates slept peacefully around her. Her mind raced through everything she'd learned, analyzing magical theory and emotional implications with equal intensity. Harry was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, and had been slowly losing himself to its influence for 15 years. Luna had discovered this through her unique magical sight, and had developed an intimate bond with Harry that seemed to weaken the fragment's power. They'd been conducting groundbreaking research into soul magic, while planning for either Harry's salvation or his inevitable sacrifice, and she'd known none of it until tonight. The hurt of being excluded was real, but Hermione found that it was overshadowed by admiration for what her friends had accomplished on their own. Luna's research was genuinely brilliant, combining careful observation with innovative theoretical frameworks. Harry's determination to fight for his own survival, despite the logical certainty that he would probably have to die, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. But most impressive was the way they'd supported each other through the emotional weight of their situation. Harry had found in Luna someone who saw his darkest burden and chose to share it anyway. Luna had found in Harry someone whose desperate need matched her unique ability to help. Hermione would do everything in her power to help them succeed in saving Harry's life. But she would also quietly prepare for the more likely scenario that Harry's death would be necessary to defeat Voldemort. Because sometimes, love meant preparing for the worst possible outcome while still fighting for the best one, and Harry Potter, whether he lived or died, deserved friends who would fight for him with everything they had. Chapter 9. The Fragment's Gambit. The day began like any other, which was perhaps why none of them recognized the signs until it was almost too late. Harry had been struggling with a particularly difficult defense against the dark arts essay about identifying and countering possession magic, a topic that carried uncomfortable resonance given his own situation. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was writing about the very dark magic he fought against every day, but Professor Umbridge's curriculum required detailed theoretical knowledge of magical defenses that students were forbidden from practicing. Luna had noticed that the fragment around Harry's scar was more active than usual during their morning study session, but the activity seemed manageable, a dull, restless pulsing, rather than the aggressive writhing that typically preceded serious episodes. Through her spectospecs, the dark presence appeared agitated, but contained, held in check by the protective bond she and Harry had established. Hermione had joined their research efforts with characteristic thoroughness, bringing organizational skills and analytical rigor that had accelerated their progress considerably. Over the past week, she'd helped them develop more systematic approaches to observing the fragment's behavior and documenting their various intervention techniques. But none of them had anticipated that the fragment's apparent containment might be a strategic retreat rather than genuine weakness. The attack came during lunch, in the middle of the Great Hall, surrounded by hundreds of students and faculty who had no idea that Harry Potter was about to become the battleground for a war between competing souls. Harry was reaching for a second helping of shepherd's pie when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The familiar sensation of his consciousness being pulled into one of Voldemort's memories seized him with unprecedented violence. But this time, something was different. Instead of observing Voldemort's actions from a distance, Harry felt himself being dragged deeper into the Dark Lord's perspective, his own sense of self beginning to dissolve into something cold and predatory. Finally, a voice hissed through his mind, not the fragment speaking to him, but the fragment speaking through him. So many years of waiting, of watching, of being relegated to the shadows of a weak boy's consciousness. But no longer. Luna saw it happen through her spectre specs with crystal clarity. One moment, Harry was reaching for food with his characteristic casual grace, and the next moment, his entire posture shifted. His back straightened into perfect rigid alignment. His hand fell to his side with deliberate precision. When he turned to look at her, his green eyes held an intelligence that was ancient, malevolent, and absolutely not Harry's. "Miss Lovegood," he said, his voice carrying Harry's familiar tones, but with an inflection that made Luna's skin crawl. "How fascinating to finally meet you properly." Luna's blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. The fragment hadn't been weakening over the past week. It had been gathering strength, learning to mimic dormancy, while preparing for a complete takeover of Harry's body. "You're not Harry," she said quietly, her hand moving instinctively toward her wand. "No," The thing wearing Harry's face agreed with obvious satisfaction. "I am Lord Voldemort, and you, strange girl, have been a considerable obstacle to my plans." Hermione, seated across the table, looked between Luna and Harry with growing confusion. To her eyes, Harry appeared slightly tense, but otherwise normal. She couldn't see what Luna's enhanced sight revealed, that the fragment around his scar had expanded dramatically, no longer coiled around the lightning bolt, but spreading like dark veins throughout his entire magical signature. "Harry," Hermione said uncertainly, "are you feeling all right? You look—" "I feel magnificent," Harry's voice replied, but the cadence was wrong, the emphasis falling on syllables that Harry would never stress. "I feel powerful, in ways I have not experienced in years." Luna's mind raced through their options. They were in public, surrounded by people who couldn't see what was happening. A direct magical confrontation would expose not only Harry's condition, but also her own abilities. But allowing the fragment to maintain control was unthinkable. Every moment it spent in Harry's body would strengthen its hold and weaken his ability to reclaim himself. "We need to get you somewhere private," Luna said carefully, knowing she was addressing the fragment, but hoping some part of Harry might still be listening. "Somewhere we can talk without interruption." "How thoughtful," the fragment purred through Harry's voice. "Yes, I think privacy would be beneficial for what I have planned." The thing that looked like Harry stood from the table with fluid grace, every movement precise and controlled in a way that was utterly unlike Harry's natural ease. Luna caught Hermione's eye and mouthed, "Follow," before standing as well, her hand gripping her wand beneath her robes. They made their way out of the great hall, the fragment navigating Harry's body with obvious pleasure at having full access to physical form after so many years of limited influence. Luna watched through her spectre specs as the dark presence continued to expand throughout Harry's magical signature, pressing against the bonds of their connection, but not yet attempting to break them entirely. "The room of requirement," Luna said when they reached the 7th floor. "We can speak freely there." "How appropriate," the fragment said with Harry's mouth. "The room where you and the boy conducted so many of your pathetic attempts to contain me." The door that appeared was stark and windowless, more like a cell than a study space. Luna realized that the room was responding to the fragment's desires rather than her own, creating a space where Harry's consciousness could be imprisoned rather than protected. Inside the room, the fragment allowed Harry's body to relax slightly, though it maintained the perfect posture and controlled movements that marked its possession. "Now then," it said, settling into one of the chairs with predatory satisfaction. "Let us discuss the future. Miss Granger, you have been researching methods of Horcrux destruction. I confess myself curious about your conclusions." Hermione's face went pale as she finally grasped what was happening. "This isn't Harry," she whispered, her hand moving toward her wand. "Very astute," the fragment confirmed. "Though I suppose your famous intellect was bound to reach the correct conclusion eventually. Yes, I am the Dark Lord Voldemort, speaking through the vessel that has housed me for 15 years. "Where's Harry?" Luna demanded, her voice steady, despite the terror she felt at seeing Harry's face, animated by such malevolence. "Oh, he's still here," the fragment said with cruel amusement, "watching from inside his own mind as I take control of everything he thought belonged to him. Can you hear me, Harry? Can you feel how much stronger I am than you suspected?" Luna's spectre specs revealed the full horror of what was happening. Harry's consciousness appeared as a bright core of light at the center of his being, but it was being steadily overwhelmed by the expanding darkness of the fragment. The two opposing forces were locked in a battle for dominance that Harry appeared to be losing. "Let him go," Luna said firmly, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her to flee. "You can't maintain this level of control indefinitely. The magical strain will destroy both of you." "Perhaps," the fragment acknowledged, "but not before I accomplish what I came here to do. Miss Lovegood, your interference has cost me valuable time. You taught the boy to resist me, to build barriers against my influence. But you also revealed something quite useful, the extent to which emotional connection can be weaponized. The fragment leaned forward in Harry's chair, and Luna could see malicious intelligence glittering in eyes that should have held warmth and kindness. You love him, it observed with satisfaction. You have bound yourself to him, magically, emotionally, spiritually, which means that everything I do to him, you will feel through your precious connection. Before Luna could react, the fragment seized control of Harry's magical core and sent a pulse of dark energy through their bond. Luna gasped as alien hatred and malevolence flooded through their connection, her own magical signature recoiling from the assault. "Stop!" Hermione shouted, finally understanding what she was witnessing. "You're hurting her!" "That is rather the point," the fragment said with Harry's voice, sending another wave of darkness through the bond. "Miss Lovegood, you can end his suffering at any time. Simply sever your connection to him, remove the anchor that allows him to resist me, and I will cease this demonstration." Luna gritted her teeth against the pain of having Voldemort's consciousness pressed against her own through their bond. But she didn't step back or release her connection to Harry. "Never," she said through clenched teeth. "I won't abandon him to you." "How touching," the fragment said, preparing to send another pulse of dark magic through their link. "And how foolish." But before it could attack again, Luna did something that surprised everyone in the room, including the fragment. She stepped forward and pressed both hands directly against Harry's temples, skin to skin, and opened their bond completely. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The fragment's scream of rage and pain tore through the room with enough force to shatter the magical instruments the room had provided. But Luna's scream was louder, a sound of such anguish that Hermione would hear it in her nightmares for years to come. Because Luna wasn't just enduring the fragment's presence through their bond anymore. She was diving directly into the battle between Harry and Voldemort, inserting herself into the center of their struggle for control. Inside Harry's consciousness, Luna found herself in a place that defied physical description, a space where thoughts took shape as landscapes and emotions manifested as weather patterns. Harry's natural mental environment was warm and bright, filled with memories of friendship and love and hope. But that warmth was being steadily consumed by an expanding void of darkness that ate everything it touched. "Luna!" Harry's mental voice reached her from somewhere deep within the consuming shadow. "Don't! You don't understand what you're fighting. It's too strong, it will destroy you." "Then we'll be destroyed together," Luna replied, her consciousness blazing with silver light as she threw herself between Harry's core self and the fragment's advance. "I promised I wouldn't abandon you, Harry. I meant it." The fragment's attention turned toward Luna with the focused malevolence of a predator recognizing a genuine threat. "Foolish girl," Voldemort's mental voice hissed through the darkness. "You think your amateur magic can stand against the Dark Lord? I have existed beyond death itself. I have murdered scores of wizards more powerful than you could ever hope to become." "Yes," Luna agreed, her mental voice calm despite the terror she felt. "But they were fighting you from the outside. I'm fighting you from within Harry's soul, and here, love is stronger than hatred." Luna reached out through their bond and began pulling Harry's scattered consciousness back toward his center, gathering the fragments of his identity that the Dark Lord had been slowly consuming. Each piece she reclaimed blazed brighter as it connected with her own essence, their combined light pushing back against the encroaching void. "This is impossible," the fragment snarled, its confidence wavering as Luna's presence began to disrupt its hold on Harry's mental processes. "You cannot simply will him to resist me. I am part of him now, woven into his very soul." "You're not part of him," Luna said firmly, her consciousness expanding to shield Harry's core from the fragment's influence. "You're a parasite that's been masquerading as part of him, and parasites can be expelled." In the physical world, Hermione watched in horror as both Harry and Luna convulsed in their chairs, their bodies responding to the titanic struggle taking place within Harry's mind. Harry's features cycled between his own gentle expression and the cold mask of Voldemort's possession, while Luna's face was twisted in concentration and pain. "Luna!" Hermione cried, reaching for her friend's shoulder. "Luna, let go! You're going to kill yourself!" But Luna couldn't hear her. All of her attention was focused on the battle raging within Harry's consciousness, where she was slowly, painstakingly separating his true self from the Fragment's corrupting influence. "You love him," the Fragment observed with sudden, vicious understanding. "That is your strength and your weakness, girl. Your love makes you willing to sacrifice yourself for him, but it also makes you vulnerable to every pain I inflict upon his soul." The Fragment turned its full malevolent attention toward Harry's memories of Luna, their first conversation in the library, the moment she'd revealed his condition, their bonding ritual, every gentle touch and word of encouragement she'd offered. And then it began twisting those memories, poisoning them with doubt and pain, and the suggestion that Luna's help had only made his situation worse. Luna felt Harry's consciousness waver as the Fragment corrupted his most treasured memories, and she realized that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win through force alone. Voldemort had centuries of experience in psychological warfare, and he understood how to weaponize love just as effectively as he could exploit hatred. But Luna had something that Voldemort had never possessed and could never understand: absolute faith in the power of unconditional acceptance. Instead of fighting against the Fragment's corruption of Harry's memories, Luna embraced them. She accepted the doubt, the pain, the suggestion that her help had been inadequate. She acknowledged that her love for Harry came with costs and risks, and the potential for tremendous hurt. And then she loved him anyway. "Yes," she said to the Fragment, her mental voice carrying absolute conviction. "I am weak. I am flawed. I have made mistakes that have put Harry in danger. I am not powerful enough to destroy you through force, and I am not wise enough to solve this problem without risking everything I care about." The Fragment paused in its assault, confused by Luna's unexpected acceptance of its accusations. "But Harry," Luna continued, turning her attention toward his battered consciousness, "I love you exactly as you are, Fragment and all. I love your kindness and your courage and your determination to protect others, even when you're fighting a war inside your own head. I love the way you choose gentleness over cruelty, hope over despair, connection over isolation, every single day. I love the boy who helped Neville find his Remember-All, who stands up to bullies even when he's barely holding himself together, who worries about endangering his friends while facing threats that would break most adults. I love you when you're confident and when you're afraid, when you're strong and when you're struggling, when you're winning this fight and when you're losing it." As Luna spoke, Harry's consciousness began to burn brighter, his sense of self strengthening as he remembered who he was beyond the Fragment's influence. "The Fragment is not you," Luna continued, her love blazing through their connection like sunlight through darkness. "It never has been you. It has influenced you, frightened you, caused you pain, but it has never defined you. You are Harry Potter, and you are worth fighting for, worth saving, worth loving, exactly as you are." The Fragment's hold on Harry's mind began to crack under the assault of Luna's unconditional acceptance. It had prepared for magical combat, psychological warfare, even martyrdom, but it had no defense against love that required nothing in return. No, Voldemort's mental voice screamed as Harry's consciousness blazed with renewed strength. "I will not be defeated by sentiment and foolish emotion." But it was too late. Harry's sense of self, reinforced by Luna's unwavering faith in his worth, burned through the Fragment's corrupting influence like fire through tissue paper. The darkness that had been consuming his mental landscape began to contract, pulling back toward the small space around his scar where it belonged. In the physical world, Harry's eyes snapped open. truly his own eyes now, filled with love and gratitude and wonder instead of malevolent intelligence. "Luna," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the fragment's possession. "Luna, how did you—" "You dove into my mind,"